It began with silence so complete that it felt intentional, a quiet stretched across forests, swamps, and front lines where nothing appeared to move, and everything was about to break. By the summer of 1944, the war in the East had already turned against Germany. Stalingrad was long past. Kursk had shattered any hope of regaining the initiative. Yet, on the maps, one massive German force still stood intact, Army Group Center anchoring the front across Belarus, confident that the worst blows would fall elsewhere. That confidence was a mistake. What the Red Army prepared was not a single attack, but a collapse engineered in advance. This was Operation Bagration, an offensive so vast, so carefully concealed, that when it struck, it erased an entire army group in a matter of weeks. The preparation was invisible by design. Troop movements were hidden at night. Radio silence masked intent. Dummy formations drew attention away from the real buildup. While German intelligence looked south and west, convinced the main blow would fall elsewhere, Soviet forces assembled in overwhelming strength opposite what appeared to be a quiet sector. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, all layered, all coordinated, all waiting. When the attack came, it came everywhere at once. Artillery fire ripped open German positions with crushing weight. Frontline defenses collapsed almost immediately. Communication lines were severed. Entire units were overwhelmed before they could reposition. Strong points that had held for years were bypassed, isolated, and destroyed. What had once been a coherent front dissolved into fragments struggling to understand what was happening. The Red Army did not advance recklessly. It advanced with intent. Breakthroughs were exploited immediately. Encirclements formed faster than withdrawals could be ordered. Rivers were crossed before defenses could be re-established. German units attempted to retreat, only to find roads cut, bridges destroyed, and Soviet armor already behind them. Supply depots fell intact. Headquarters vanished. Orders arrived too late to matter. Belarus became a landscape of collapse. Forests swallowed retreating columns. Marshes trapped vehicles and men alike. Air power struck relentlessly once movement was exposed. What had taken years to build was dismantled in weeks. Entire German corps were encircled and annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Minsk fell in rapid succession, each loss compounding the next. By the time Minsk was encircled, the destruction of Army Group Center was undeniable. This was not just defeat. It was erasure. Operation Bagration stands as one of the most devastating military disasters in history, not because of a single failed decision, but because the entire structure collapsed at once. German reserves were insufficient. Command responses were slow. The Red Army's coordination, deception, and overwhelming force left no room for recovery. And yet, the human cost was immense. Belarus was devastated. Civilians were caught between collapsing fronts. Cities and villages were reduced to ruins. Victory came with suffering, measured in lives and destruction that would linger long after the front moved on. Bagration mattered because it changed the war's geometry. It destroyed Germany's ability to defend the Eastern Front as a coherent force. It opened the road to Poland. It pushed the Red Army to the borders of Germany itself. From this moment forward, the war in the East no longer asked whether Germany could recover, only how long collapse could be delayed. Operation Bagration shows what modern, total war looks like when preparation meets opportunity. It shows how deception can be as powerful as firepower, how patience can be deadlier than speed, how an army can cease to exist without a single dramatic final battle. Tonight, we return to that quiet front that was never truly quiet, to the forests and roads where an entire army vanished, to the offensive that reshaped the Eastern War beyond repair, to Operation Bagration, where silence became destruction. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening closely, if these long, immersive journeys into history help you slow down, focus, or step away from the noise of the day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time, carefully, calmly, and without turning history into spectacle. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting content, you're helping keep this kind of thoughtful, unhurried storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, understanding, or simply somewhere quiet to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of Operation Bagration. June 20th, 1944. A German observation post near Vitebsk, Belarus. Oberleutnant Johann Dannhauser pressed his binoculars against tired eyes and scanned the eastern horizon for the third time that hour. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn darkness except the gentle sway of birch trees in the summer wind. For 3 weeks, the front had been unnaturally quiet, no probing attacks, no artillery harassment, not even the usual nocturnal reconnaissance patrols that had become routine along this 700-mile stretch of Army Group Center's defensive line. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, but Dannhauser couldn't articulate what. He lowered the binoculars and lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the flare of the match briefly illuminating the face of a man who sensed his world was about to end. 2 days later, Johann Dannhauser would be dead. Within a week, his entire division would cease to exist. Within 3 weeks, the German Army Group Center, defending the widest front in military history, with nearly 500,000 men, would be destroyed so completely that historians would struggle to find adequate comparisons. But on that June night, standing in his sandbagged position overlooking the Dvina River, Dannhauser knew only the suffocating weight of silence and the instinctive fear that comes before catastrophe. What he couldn't see in the darkness beyond his position were 168 Soviet rifle divisions, 40 tank brigades, and 6,000 aircraft preparing to unleash the largest offensive operation in military history. The trap was already closing. By June 1944, the Eastern Front had become a study in contradictions. While Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy and captured headlines across the Western world, the real weight of German military power remained locked in a death struggle across the forests, swamps, and steppes of Eastern Europe. Army Group Center occupied the belly of the German defensive line, a massive, salient bulging eastward into Soviet territory like a fist thrust toward Moscow. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded this vast sector, with 43 divisions spread impossibly thin across terrain that swallowed armies whole. The arithmetic was simple and terrifying. 700 miles of front divided by 486,000 combat troops yielded barely 700 men per mile, half the density military doctrine demanded for static defense. But arithmetic wasn't what concerned Busch's staff officers during those final days of peace. It was the silence. The German intelligence apparatus, once the finest in Europe, had become a victim of its own preconceptions by the spring of 1944. Major Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Intelligence for the Eastern Front, had spent May compiling reports that should have triggered alarm bells throughout the Wehrmacht command structure. His analysts counted Soviet divisions opposite Army Group Center and reached disturbing conclusions. Where there should be perhaps 80 to 90 rifle divisions based on historical patterns, they identified 120. Radio intercepts suggested massive ammunition stockpiling. Partisan activity had increased dramatically. Gehlen's May 15th assessment warned explicitly of a major Soviet offensive targeting Belarusia, the Russian heartland that Army Group Center defended. The report went to OKH headquarters in East Prussia with Gehlen's personal endorsement. It was dismissed within 48 hours. The generals in their comfortable offices 500 miles behind the front had already decided where the Soviets would attack: Ukraine. All evidence to the contrary was explained away as deception, as feints, as anything but what it actually was, the truth. This failure of intelligence stemmed from a deeper institutional blindness. Adolf Hitler had become convinced that Stalin would strike toward the Romanian oil fields in the south, the resource-rich region whose loss would cripple the German war machine. Logic supported this assessment. Attacking a critical resource made strategic sense. But logic assumed the Soviets thought like Germans, that they valued elegant strategic solutions over brutal operational realities. Hitler's conviction hardened into dogma, and dogma crushed dissent. When Gehlen's reports contradicted the Führer's intuition, they were revised, softened, or ignored. Meanwhile, German mobile reserves, the panzer divisions that might have blunted a Soviet breakthrough, flowed south toward Army Group North Ukraine. The 4th Panzer Army, 2nd Army, and what remained of Germany's mechanized striking power positioned themselves to counter an offensive that would never come. Army Group Center would face the largest military operation in history, with virtually no armored reserves, no air support, and no realistic hope of reinforcement. The doctrine that would seal Army Group Center's fate had been christened with typical German thoroughness, Fester Platz, or fortified place. In theory, the concept made military sense designate key cities as fortress strongpoints that would anchor the defensive line and prevent Soviet breakthrough and exploitation. In practice, Hitler's implementation transformed sound doctrine into suicide pact. 5 cities received Festerplatz designation: Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Minsk. Their garrisons received explicit orders to hold to the last man, regardless of tactical circumstances. Requests for tactical withdrawal would be denied. Encirclement was preferable to retreat. This wasn't defensive strategy. It was ideological rigidity masquerading as military planning. Field Marshal Walter Model, who would later replace Bush, understood the fatal flaw immediately. Fortified cities without mobile reserves to support them weren't anchors, they were prisons. But in June 1944, Model commanded Army Group North Ukraine and could only watch as Army Group Center dug its own grave. The Luftwaffe's collapse compounded every other German weakness. In 1941, the German Air Force had achieved total air superiority over the Eastern Front, enabling the reconnaissance, ground support, and interdiction that made Blitzkrieg possible. 3 years of attrition, strategic bombing campaigns over Germany, and industrial exhaustion had reduced the once mighty Luftwaffe to a shadow force. The 6th Air Fleet, responsible for supporting Army Group Center, could muster exactly 40 operational aircraft by late June. 40 aircraft to cover 700 miles of front against an enemy known to be massing thousands of planes. Luftwaffe commanders pleaded for reinforcements from the West, from Germany, from anywhere. The Reich Air Ministry explained patiently that fighters were needed to defend German cities from American daylight bombing raids. Ground support aircraft were committed in Normandy. There were no reserves. Army Group Center would fight blind, unable to conduct reconnaissance, unable to interdict Soviet supply lines, unable to provide close air support for infantry under attack. The sky belonged to the enemy. Among the forward positions, the soldiers sensed what their generals refused to acknowledge. Letters home during those final days carried an unmistakable tone of foreboding that German censors found increasingly difficult to suppress. "The Russians are planning something," wrote Corporal Klaus Neuber from his foxhole near Orsha. "We hear trucks every night beyond no man's land, always moving west, always at night. When we send patrols to investigate, they find nothing, the roads are empty by dawn. But we know what we hear." Veteran non-commissioned officers, the backbone of Wehrmacht effectiveness, began taking unauthorized precautions. Ammunition was quietly stockpiled beyond regulation levels. Escape routes were scouted and memorized. Personal effects were packed for rapid evacuation. These were the actions of men who understood their situation with clarity that eluded their commanding officers. They were trapped in a salient with enemies before them, swamps behind them, and orders that forbade common sense. The final week before the storm brought strange atmospheric phenomena. Veterans would later speak of the quality of light, the thickness of the air, the way sound seemed to travel differently across no man's land. On June 22nd, exactly 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa had launched Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, forward German observers reported unusual sounds in the darkness. Not the random noise of nighttime military activity, but something orchestrated: the rumble of thousands of engines, the metallic clanking of tracked vehicles, the low murmur of voices speaking Russian in disciplined whispers. At 2 a.m, listening posts from Vitebsk to Bobruisk reported the same phenomenon. Staff officers reviewed the reports and reached the only conclusion that preserved their sanity. The Soviets were conducting exercises, nothing more. Armies don't attack at night. Armies don't move entire tank corps in darkness. The Soviets were simply being loud and clumsy, as Russians always were. This rationalization lasted 4 more hours. As dawn approached on June 23, 1944, Johann Dannhauser's replacement, the young lieutenant, had been rotated to a rest area the day before. A transfer that would save his life stood in the same observation post and watched the eastern sky. The sun would rise at 4:57. At 5 o'clock exactly, the world would end in fire. But for 3 more minutes, there was only the gentle sound of wind through birch trees, the distant call of a nightingale, and the illusion of peace. Behind the German positions, radio operators monitored their sets and heard nothing unusual. In command bunkers, staff officers prepared routine morning reports noting no special activity on Army Group Center's front. 500 miles to the south, in comfortable headquarters in Ukraine, German divisions waited for the offensive that would never threaten them. And in the forests and fields of Belarus, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers waited for the signal that would begin the destruction of Hitler's empire in the east. The quiet had been deliberate, orchestrated, and utterly deceptive. What the Germans had mistaken for weakness was actually the coiling of a spring. What they had interpreted as inactivity was the final breath before the plunge. In 3 minutes, the largest military operation in human history would explode across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Pripyat marshes. An Army Group Center, blind and immobile, would discover too late that silence is sometimes the sound of perfect preparation. April 12, 1944. The Kremlin, Moscow. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood before a wall-sized map of the Eastern Front and traced his finger along a 700-mile arc through Belarus. Behind him, Joseph Stalin paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the same territorial bulge that represented German Army Group Center. The room smelled of Stalin's pipe tobacco and the stale air of closed windows. The General Secretary trusted no one, including the Moscow Spring. 5 other men occupied the chamber: Marshals Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and Timoshenko, along with Deputy Chief of Staff Antonov and Air Marshal Novikov. They had been summoning to discuss something unprecedented in Soviet military history, an offensive operation designed not merely to push back the Germans, but to destroy an entire army group through coordinated encirclement. What emerged from that April meeting would become Operation Bagration, named after the Georgian prince general who fought Napoleon, and it would represent the apex of Soviet operational art. The planning began with cold arithmetic. Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky had spent March analyzing the German defensive disposition across the Eastern Front, searching for exploitable vulnerabilities. What he found in Belarus surprised even his experienced eye. German Army Group Center occupied the widest front with the fewest troops, its divisions spread impossibly thin, its flanks dangling in the air without natural obstacles or sufficient reserves to backstop penetrations. Better still, the sector's terrain, which had favored German defense in 1941, now favored Soviet offense. The forests and swamps that had channeled German attacks into kill zones would now conceal Soviet preparations and limit German lateral movement. Vasilevsky presented his findings with the systematic precision that had made him indispensable to Stalin. Army Group Center could be encircled and destroyed if the Soviets achieved simultaneous breakthroughs on multiple axes, with sufficient depth to prevent German reserves from sealing the gaps. The operation would require unprecedented coordination between 4 separate fronts, Soviet equivalent of German army groups, and the concentration of overwhelming force at breakthrough sectors. Stalin listened to Vasilevsky's presentation without interruption, then asked the question that defined Soviet strategic thinking in 1944. What will this cost? The Soviet Union had been bleeding for 3 years, its male population decimated, its western territories devastated, its industrial base strained beyond sustainability. Every offensive operation required a calculation of blood, how many lives to achieve, what objective. Vasilevsky had prepared his answer with uncomfortable honesty. To destroy Army Group Center and liberate Belarus would require allocating 2.5 million men, 5,200 tanks, 36,000 artillery pieces, and 6,000 aircraft to the operation. Expected casualties ranged from 60,000 to 180,000, depending on variables like German response time and weather conditions. The cost was staggering. Stalin's response was immediate: proceed with planning. The General Secretary had performed his own calculation. The strategic value of destroying Germany's largest army group and advancing Soviet forces 400 miles closer to Berlin justified whatever price the Red Army would pay. The command structure for Bagration reflected hard lessons learned from 3 years of costly mistakes. Rather than appointing a single commander, a recipe for bottlenecks and delays, Stalin designated 4 front commanders who would operate with unusual independence. General Ivan Bagration would command 1st Baltic Front. General Ivan Chernyakhovsky would lead 3rd Belarusian Front. General Georgy Zakharov would direct 2nd Belarusian Front, and Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky would command 1st Belarusian Front. Zhukov and Vasilevsky would coordinate overall operations as Stavka representatives, essentially Stalin's personal troubleshooters, with authority to override front commanders if necessary. This distributed command structure meant that 4 simultaneous offensives would strike Army Group Center from different directions, making German defensive response exponentially more difficult. If one front stalled, the others could maintain pressure. If the Germans shifted reserves to block one thrust, the others would exploit the resulting weakness. It was chess played with armies, and Stalin intended to force checkmate. The plan's audacity emerged during the crucial May meetings when operational details were refined. Rokossovsky, commanding the crucial 1st Belarusian Front that would strike toward Minsk from the south, presented his attack concept to Stalin and immediately triggered a confrontation that would become legendary in Soviet military circles. Rokossovsky proposed striking with 2 powerful thrusts, instead of concentrating forces into a single breakthrough, a violation of Soviet doctrine that emphasized overwhelming force at a single point. Stalin, predictably, erupted. 2 thrusts will divide your forces and dilute breakthrough power, the General Secretary growled. Concentrate everything on one axis. Rokossovsky stood his ground, explaining that German defenses were strongest in the center but vulnerable on the flanks, that 2 simultaneous breakthroughs would create multiple encirclement opportunities. That flexibility trumped concentration. The argument continued for 3 days across multiple meetings. Finally, in an almost unprecedented display of strategic flexibility, Stalin yielded. Proceed with your 2 thrusts, he conceded. But if they fail, it will be your head. Rokossovsky saluted and left the Kremlin, knowing he had just won approval for tactical innovation that defied Soviet orthodoxy. The operational objectives were ambitious to the point of seeming fantastical. Phase 1 would achieve breakthrough of German defensive zones and encirclement of the fortress cities Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk within 7 to 10 days. Phase 2 would see exploitation forces the tank armies and mechanized corps held in reserve thrust deep into the German rear to encircle remaining forces near Minsk. Phase 3. The most ambitious, envisioned pursuit operations all the way to the Vistula River in Poland, an advance of 350 miles that would liberate Belarusia entirely and position Soviet forces on Germany's pre-war eastern border. Skeptics within the general staff considered these timelines impossible. Soviet offensives historically bogged down after initial successes due to logistics failures, German counterattacks, and operational exhaustion. But Vasilevsky insisted this time would be different. Every lesson from 3 years of war had been incorporated into Bagration's planning: surprise through deception, overwhelming concentration at breakthrough points, deep reserves positioned to exploit success, and critically logistics preparation that would sustain operations through Phase 3. The deception plan, codenamed Operation Maskirovka, was assigned directly to Marshal Zhukov with Stalin's personal instruction: make the Germans look south. Throughout May, Zhukov orchestrated an elaborate fiction designed to convince German intelligence that the main Soviet summer offensive would target Army Group North Ukraine and drive toward the Romanian oil fields. False radio traffic simulated the assembly of tank armies opposite Ukraine. Dummy equipment, wooden tanks, inflatable trucks, fake supply dumps was positioned where German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph them. Real units were ostentatiously transferred south in daylight, then secretly returned north at night. Marshal Ivan Konev, commanding 1st Ukrainian Front, toured frontline positions in full uniform with maximum publicity, granting interviews to Soviet journalists about the coming southern offensive. Meanwhile, in Belarusia, 2.5 million men moved into attack positions under the strictest operational security ever enforced by the Red Army. All movement occurred at night. Radio silence was absolute, and units were forbidden from conducting reconnaissance that might alert German defenders. German intelligence, already predisposed to believe the main blow would fall in Ukraine, swallowed the deception completely. The logistics preparation represented a revolution in Soviet military capability. In 1941, the Red Army had advanced barely 200 miles before outrunning its supply lines and collapsing under German counterattacks. By 1944, 3 years of hard experience and American Lend-Lease support had transformed Soviet logistics from catastrophic weakness to genuine strength. The Bagration stockpile was staggering: 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of fuel, 250,000 tons of food and other supplies, 200,000 American Studebaker trucks. Perhaps the most important Lend-Lease contribution would haul supplies from railheads to advancing spearheads. Railway troops had pre-positioned materials to rapidly convert recaptured German gauge track to Soviet gauge, ensuring supply lines could advance with combat units. Field hospitals, repair facilities, fuel dumps, and ammunition points were positioned in depth, ready to leapfrog forward as the offensive unrolled. For the first time in the war, Soviet planners anticipated logistical requirements not for a 10-day battle, but for a 2-month campaign of continuous operations. The coordination with partisan forces represented another breakthrough in Soviet operational planning. Belarus harbored the strongest partisan movement in occupied Europe: 374,000 fighters, organized into brigades and operating from forest bases that controlled 60% of the republic's territory. Previous Soviet offensives had benefited from partisan support, but Bagration integrated partisan operations into the overall plan with unprecedented sophistication. The central staff of the partisan movement, operating from Moscow via radio links, would coordinate simultaneous sabotage operations to begin 48 hours before the main assault. Targets were specific: railway bridges, communication cables, supply dumps, and headquarters facilities. The timing was crucial too early, and the Germans would have time to repair damage. Too late, and Soviet breakthrough forces would face intact German logistics. Partisan intelligence had also provided detailed information on German defensive positions, minefields, and troop dispositions that regular reconnaissance could never have obtained. When Bagration began, German Army Group Center would discover that the ground beneath their feet was controlled by the enemy. As June approached, Stalin made the final decision that would define Bagration's symbolic significance. The offensive would begin on June 22nd, exactly 3 years after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. The symmetry was deliberate. What began on that date in 1941 would effectively end on the same date in 1944. During the final planning conference on June 10th, Stalin walked to the map and placed his finger on Minsk, the Belarusian capital that had fallen in the first week of the German invasion. "We will take this city back," he announced quietly, "and we will destroy the army that took it from us." The room was silent. Every officer present understood they were witnessing the culmination of 3 years of suffering, adaptation, and preparation. The Red Army of June 1944 bore almost no resemblance to the Red Army of June 1941. It was larger, better equipped, professionally commanded, and animated by a fury that 3 years of German occupation had forged into steel. What was about to unfold in Belarus would prove that the student had surpassed the teacher, that the Soviet military had learned every lesson the Germans had taught and added innovations the Germans couldn't match. The trap was set, the bait taken, and the spring coiled to its maximum tension. All that remained was to release it and watch an empire begin to collapse. June 19th, 1944. Deep in the Naliboki forest, 40 miles south of Minsk. Vasily Korj crushed the cigarette beneath his boot and studied the map spread across the wooden table in his partisan brigade headquarters. The map showed German railway lines throughout Belarus, marked with red circles, 47 separate demolition targets that his 1,200 fighters would strike in exactly 36 hours. Korj was 42 years old, a former Red Army colonel who had escaped German encirclement in 1941 and spent 3 years building one of the most effective partisan formations in occupied Europe. His brigade controlled nearly 300 square miles of forest and villages, operated its own repair workshops, maintained radio contact with Moscow, and had transformed from desperate refugees into a disciplined military force. Now Moscow was calling in 3 years of preparation for a single coordinated blow that would begin the liberation of Belarus Kors checked his watch 0 hour minus 36 hours and began issuing orders to his company commanders. The Belarusian partisan movement had been born in desperation and matured through brutality. When German forces swept across Soviet Belarusia in summer 1941, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers found themselves cut off behind rapidly advancing German lines. Some surrendered, many were killed, but tens of thousands melted into Belarusia's vast forests and began conducting desperate raids for food and weapons. These early partisan groups were militarily insignificant, disorganized, poorly armed, and focused primarily on survival. But German occupation policy guaranteed the partisan movement would grow exponentially. Nazi racial ideology classified Belarusians as untermenschen subhumans, whose land would be colonized and whose people would be worked to death or eliminated. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned with their inhabitants inside. Jews were systematically murdered. Forced labor conscription emptied communities. The choice facing Belarusian civilians became stark: submit to slow death under occupation or flee to the forests and fight. By 1944, 374,000 people had chosen the forests. The transformation of partisan bands into effective military formations began in late 1942, when the central staff of the partisan movement was established in Moscow with the mission of coordinating resistance behind German lines. Key to this effort was radio communication. The Soviets airdropped thousands of radio sets to partisan groups, along with trained operators who could transmit intelligence to Moscow and receive operational orders. This communication network transformed isolated resistance into coordinated strategy. Partisan brigades began receiving supply drops of weapons, ammunition, explosives, and medical supplies delivered by Soviet transport aircraft that flew night missions into forest clearings. Training materials arrived via radio instructions on demolition techniques, ambush tactics, intelligence gathering. By early 1944, the partisan movement had evolved into what German security forces called an army in our rear, controlling vast swaths of territory, operating field hospitals and workshops, even collecting taxes and administering justice in liberated zones. The German response to partisan operations revealed the fundamental impossibility of the occupation. 25 Wehrmacht and SS security divisions, roughly 300,000 troops who might otherwise have fought on the front lines, were committed to anti-partisan operations throughout occupied Soviet territory. In Belarusia, these units conducted massive pacification sweeps that killed tens of thousands of civilians while failing to eliminate the partisan threat. The mathematics worked against the Germans. Belarusia comprised 80,000 square miles of forest, swamp, and farmland, far too much territory for 25 divisions to control. Partisans could always melt away into forests that stretched for hundreds of miles, wait for German units to depart, then return and resume operations. Worse, German brutality created a continuous flow of recruits who chose partisan life over victimhood. Every village burned sent survivors into partisan ranks. Every atrocity witnessed created new fighters, animated by vengeance. By June 1944, partisan forces controlled approximately 60% of Belarusian territory in what they called partisan republics, areas where Soviet administration functioned. Red Army ranks still applied, and the German occupation was purely theoretical. Intelligence gathering had become one of the partisan movement's most valuable contributions to the Soviet war effort. Every partisan brigade included reconnaissance units that monitored German troop movements, defensive positions, supply routes, and headquarters locations. This information flowed to Moscow via radio, where it was compiled, analyzed, and forwarded to Red Army commands planning operations. For Bagration, partisan intelligence proved invaluable. They provided detailed maps showing every German strongpoint, bunker, minefield, and supply dump along Army Group Center's defensive positions. They counted trains, identified divisions by unit markings, reported on German morale and supply conditions. Some partisan units had penetrated German labor organizations and could report on construction of fortifications and defensive works. German Army Group Center thought they were defending against an enemy to their east. In reality, tens of thousands of hostile intelligence gatherers operated in their midst, reporting their every move to Moscow. The Rail War Relsovaya Voyna represented the culmination of 3 years of partisan preparation. Moscow's instructions arrived via radio on June 15th. On the night of June 19th to 20th, all partisan brigades would simultaneously attack German railway infrastructure throughout Belarusia. The targets were specific: rails, bridges, switching stations, signal installations. The timing was critical. Explosions must occur within a 4-hour window to maximize confusion and prevent German repair efforts from concentrating on any single sector. Each partisan brigade received quotas. Korja's unit was responsible for 47 demolition sites spread across 80 miles of track. The explosives had been accumulating for months, stockpiled in forest caches and village hideouts. 40,000 demolition charges waited for deployment. The operation would require coordination that partisan forces had never before attempted. Simultaneous attacks across hundreds of miles by thousands of independent groups, all timed to a Moscow schedule. The night of June 19th to 20th, 1944 was cloudless and warm, good weather for demolition work. Across Belarusia, partisan demolition teams moved toward their assigned targets, carrying explosives wrapped in cloth to muffle metallic sounds. German railway security, thin at best, given manpower demands, was about to be overwhelmed. At exactly 10 o'clock in the evening, the first explosions thundered through the Belarusian night. Within 4 hours, 10,500 separate demolition attacks destroyed rail lines, bridges, and switching stations across every major German supply route in Belarusia. The coordination was nearly perfect. Partisan groups, from the Lithuanian border to the Pripyat marshes, struck within minutes of each other. By dawn on June 20th, German railway officials attempting to assess damage discovered that approximately 42% of their rail capacity had been destroyed in a single night. Repair crews, arriving at destroyed sections, found that partisans had not merely blown the rails, but had removed entire segments, scattering them in nearby forests where recovery would require days. Worse, partisan groups maintained surveillance on repair sites, ambushing work crews and forcing the Germans to assign infantry security that further strained their overstretched forces. The communication attacks complemented the rail war's devastation. Partisan specialists who had worked as telephone technicians under Soviet rule knew exactly where major German communication cables ran through Belarusian forests. On June 21st, 36 hours before the main Soviet offensive, partisan teams struck German communication infrastructure with systematic precision. Major trunk lines connecting army headquarters to corps commands were cut simultaneously at multiple points. Buried cables were dug up and destroyed. Telegraph stations were raided and equipment smashed. The psychological impact was immediate. German commanders who had grown accustomed to reliable telephonic communication suddenly found themselves isolated, dependent on radio transmissions that Soviet intelligence could intercept, or on motorcycle couriers who could be ambushed by partisan patrols. Field Marshal Bush's Army Group Center headquarters discovered on June 21st that it had lost contact with subordinate headquarters across the front. Technicians worked frantically to restore connections, but every repaired line was cut again within hours. By June 22nd, German communication infrastructure in Belarusia was degraded by an estimated 70%. Personal accounts from partisan fighters reveal the human dimension of these operations. Anatoly Vershigora, a partisan commander who later wrote extensively about the movement, described the 24 hours before the Soviet offensive began as electric with anticipation. His unit had positioned itself near German defensive lines with orders to guide Soviet breakthrough forces through gaps in German minefields and to provide intelligence on strongpoint locations. When Soviet artillery preparation began on June 23rd, Vershigora watched from forest positions as German defensive lines disappeared under bombardment. "We had waited 3 years for this moment," he wrote. 3 years of hiding, running, watching our people murdered. Now we were no longer victims, we were guides, showing the Red Army the path to vengeance. As Soviet infantry advanced, partisan guides appeared from forest positions to lead them through swamps and forests that would otherwise have channeled attacks into German kill zones. German defenders found themselves engaged not merely from their front, but from their flanks and rear, as partisan units that knew every forest path struck, communication trenches, and command posts. The German response to the partisan offensive revealed an organization overwhelmed by cascading catastrophes. Security divisions that might have contained partisan activities were already committed to anti-partisan operations elsewhere, or held in reserve against the expected Soviet offensive. When the rail war destroyed German logistics on June 19th, security forces were dispatched to guard repair sites. When the communication attacks isolated headquarters on June 21st, security forces were assigned to protect cable repair crews. When the main Soviet offensive began on June 23rd, German commanders discovered that partisan activities had consumed the reserves that might have been committed against Soviet breakthrough forces. Field reports from German units during these chaotic days repeatedly note partisan ambushes on supply columns, attacks on headquarters, and interdiction of retreat routes. The partisan movement had become a third dimension of the battlefield, neither frontline combat nor rear area security, but something in between that German doctrine hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter. As Army Group Center began its collapse under Soviet assault, partisan forces emerged from forests to cut escape routes, capture German supply dumps, and liberate villages before Red Army troops arrived. The Shadow Army that had survived 3 years in Belarus's forests was now guiding the liberation of their homeland, and their knowledge of terrain, German dispositions, and local population would prove as valuable as entire divisions of Soviet reinforcements. May 23, 1944. A muddy field 60 miles south of Kiev, Ukraine. German aerial reconnaissance pilot Hauptmann Werner Schulz circled his Focke-Wulf at 3,000 meters and photographed what appeared to be a massive Soviet tank concentration below. Through his camera sight, he counted row after row of 34 tanks, probably 200 vehicles arranged in neat staging areas alongside ammunition dumps and fuel storage sites. Schulz's pulse quickened. This was exactly what intelligence had been searching for, proof that the main Soviet summer offensive would target Army Group North Ukraine and drive toward Romania. He exposed an entire roll of film, marked the coordinates carefully, and turned west toward base. Within 6 hours, his photographs would reach Galen's intelligence staff. Within 12 hours, German High Command would analyze them and conclude their assessment of Soviet intentions was correct. What Hauptmann Schulz had actually photographed were wooden frames covered with painted canvas dummy tanks that would never fire a shot. He had just become an unwitting participant in the most sophisticated military deception operation of World War II. Soviet Maskirovka, the art of military deception, had evolved from crude improvisation in 1941 to systematic science by 1944. The term itself was deceptive in its simplicity. Maskirovka translates roughly as masking or camouflage, but Soviet military theorists used it to encompass the entire spectrum of concealment, misdirection, and disinformation that might confuse enemy understanding of Soviet intentions. Early war Maskirovka had been rudimentary camouflaging individual tanks with branches, moving troops at night, maintaining radio silence. But the disasters of 1941 and 42 had taught Soviet commanders that German operational intelligence was sophisticated enough to penetrate simple deceptions. By 1943, Maskirovka had become a specialized branch of operational planning, with dedicated staff officers, standardized techniques, and integration into every phase of offensive preparation. For Bagration, Soviet deception planners constructed a false reality so convincing that German intelligence services never questioned it until Soviet shells were falling on German positions. The strategic deception began with geographic misdirection. Throughout May 1944, Soviet forces opposite Army Group North Ukraine in the south conducted conspicuous preparations for offensive operations. Marshal Ivan Konev, commanding 1st Ukrainian Front, personally toured frontline positions in full uniform with maximum visibility. Soviet radio nets in Ukraine increased traffic volume dramatically, simulating the communication patterns that preceded major offensives. False supply dumps were constructed, where German reconnaissance could observe them, wooden crates arranged to resemble ammunition stockpiles, fuel barrels filled with water, even mock field hospitals with false Red Cross markings. German aerial reconnaissance photographed these installations repeatedly, and each photograph reinforced the deception. Meanwhile, actual supply dumps in Belarus were camouflaged with fanatical attention to detail, covered with local vegetation that was replaced daily to prevent wilting that might be visible from the air, positioned under forest canopy, or in gullies, invisible from above. The operational deception focused on concealing the massive troop movements that would position 2.5 million men for Bagration's offensive. Soviet planners understood that this scale of movement, involving thousands of trucks, hundreds of trains, and entire armies changing positions, would be detectable unless extraordinary measures were employed. The solution was temporal. All movement toward Belarusian positions occurred exclusively at night. Divisions that had been fighting in Ukraine were pulled from the line, transported north by rail at night with lights extinguished, then moved into forest positions before dawn. By day, these same divisions were represented in their original positions by elaborate radio deception, small signals units, transmitted false messages using the original division codes and frequencies, creating an electronic signature that suggested no movement had occurred. German signals intelligence, monitoring Soviet radio traffic, detected no unusual patterns opposite Army Group Center, while simultaneously picking up massive traffic increases opposite Army Group North Ukraine. Vehicle camouflage reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Every truck, tank, and artillery piece moving into position in Belarus was covered with foliage cut from local forests. But Soviet Maskirovka specialists understood that foliage dies and changes color within hours. Dried leaves and wilted branches would be visible to German aerial reconnaissance as unnatural dark patches. Orders therefore required that camouflage be replaced every 12 hours. Entire units were assigned camouflage detail, cutting fresh vegetation each evening and morning to maintain natural appearance. Tank armies moved into staging areas and immediately disappeared under canopy that was indistinguishable from natural forest. German reconnaissance aircraft flying over these positions photographed nothing unusual. Soviet armies had effectively become invisible. This camouflage discipline was maintained for weeks, requiring millions of man-hours of labor that could otherwise have been used for combat preparation. Soviet commanders considered it time well spent. Surprise would be worth divisions of reinforcements. The dummy equipment operation represented Maskirovka, raised to theater level. Throughout May and early June, Soviet deception units deployed thousands of pieces of false equipment across positions opposite Army Group North Ukraine. Dummy tanks were constructed from wooden frames covered with painted canvas, visually identical to real 34s when photographed from altitude. Inflatable trucks, literally rubber balloons, shaped like vehicles, were deployed in false motor pools. False artillery positions featured wooden gun barrels positioned to cast authentic shadows. The scale was staggering. German reconnaissance cataloged over 1,200 tanks in Ukraine that didn't exist. Supply dumps photographed by the Luftwaffe represented crates full of rocks. Entire false divisions appeared on German intelligence maps based on dummy equipment concentrations. Meanwhile, real Soviet tank armies in Belarus remained completely undetected because they were either concealed under forest camouflage or positioned far enough behind the front that German reconnaissance couldn't reach them. Radio deception achieved a sophistication that German signals intelligence couldn't penetrate. Soviet signals units created entirely false radio networks that simulated the communication patterns of tank armies, artillery divisions, and front headquarters. These false networks transmitted thousands of messages, daily logistics requests, fire missions, reconnaissance reports, administrative traffic, all completely fabricated, but adhering to authentic Soviet radio procedure and using genuine codes captured from real units. German signals intelligence intercept these transmissions, concluded that major Soviet formations were concentrating in Ukraine. The deception was layered. False networks sometimes transmitted in codes that the Soviets knew the Germans had broken, ensuring the Germans would intercept and decode information, confirming their preconceptions. Meanwhile, genuine radio traffic in Belarus was reduced to near zero. The few essential transmissions were made using landline communications or by short-range radio that German intercept stations couldn't detect. The human dimension of Maskirovka required discipline on a scale unprecedented in military operations. 2.5 million men were moving into position for Bagration, and every single one of them understood that operational security could mean the difference between surprise and slaughter. No letters home could mention locations or unit movements. No soldier could leave his designated area where he might be seen by civilians who might be German informers. Smoking was forbidden during nighttime movements, when cigarettes could be spotted from German observation posts. Talking was conducted in whispers. Vehicle engines were muffled with wrapped exhaust systems that reduced sound transmission. Even cooking fires were forbidden during daylight. Troops ate cold rations rather than risk smoke that might be visible. This level of operational security, maintained across multiple armies for weeks, represented a maturity in Soviet military culture that would have been impossible in 1941. The final element of the deception plan involved timing, revealing the truth only when it was too late for German countermeasures. Soviet commanders understood that complete deception was impossible to maintain indefinitely. Eventually, German reconnaissance would penetrate Soviet positions, or deserters would reveal preparations, or simple logic would suggest that something was wrong with the intelligence picture. The solution was to accept eventual detection, but ensure it came too late for effective German response. Soviet assault units moved into their final positions only 36 to 48 hours before the offensive began. Too little time for German intelligence to assess the threat, and for German high command to redeploy. Reserves. By the time Field Marshal Bush realized on June 22nd that he faced not 80 divisions, but 168, Soviet artillery was already ranging in on his defensive positions. The trap had worked perfectly. German mobile reserves sat 400 miles south of where they were needed. German intelligence had been systematically deceived for 6 weeks, and Army Group Center stood unprepared for the largest offensive in military history. As dawn broke on June 23, 1944, German intelligence officers across Army Group Center began receiving reports that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Aerial reconnaissance flights that managed to penetrate Soviet air defenses photographed Soviet artillery concentrations that shouldn't exist. Radio intercept stations detected sudden massive increases in Soviet transmissions from positions that had been silent for weeks. Forward observers reported sounds of tank engines behind Soviet lines in sectors where no armor was supposed to be deployed. The fiction was collapsing, but collapse came at the moment when fiction no longer mattered. Soviet guns were about to fire. In Ukraine, meanwhile, the false divisions continued their false preparations, tying down German reserves until the afternoon of June 23rd, when High Command finally realized they had been magnificently deceived. Marshal Zhukov, monitoring the operation from his headquarters, allowed himself a rare smile when reports confirmed that German reinforcements were still in Ukraine. The greatest trick in military history had convinced the enemy to position their reserves exactly where they couldn't respond to the real threat. And now, with surprise achieved and German armies immobilized by their own miscalculations, the time had come to spring the trap and begin the destruction of Army Group Center. June 23, 1944. 4 o'clock in the morning, Soviet artillery positions near Vitebsk. Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Mikhin crouched behind his 122mm howitzer and checked his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. Around him in the pre-dawn darkness, 31,000 artillery pieces sat in carefully surveyed positions, their barrels elevated at precisely calculated angles, their crews standing ready with shells stacked in neat pyramids. Mikhin commanded a battery of 6 guns, but he knew his battery was merely one note in a symphony of destruction that would begin in exactly 57 minutes. The artillery plan for Operation Bagration was 147 pages long, specifying the exact timing, target, and ammunition type for every gun across a 700-mile front. 3 years earlier, Soviet artillery had been poorly coordinated, inadequately supplied, and tactically primitive. Now it had become the most sophisticated artillery force in the world, and it was about to demonstrate capabilities that would redefine modern warfare. The transformation of Soviet artillery doctrine had been purchased with catastrophic defeats. In 1941, Soviet guns had fired blindly at unseen targets, wasting precious ammunition while German forces maneuvered around poorly coordinated barrages. By 1942, Soviet artillery theorists were studying German techniques and developing improvements. By 1943, they had systematically cataloged every lesson learned from 2 years of failure. Now, in June 1944, Soviet artillery preparation embodied revolutionary concepts: reconnaissance in force to identify strong points, concentrated fire on breakthrough sectors, rolling barrages synchronized with infantry advance, mobile artillery groups that could leapfrog forward to maintain continuous fire support. The Bagration artillery plan assigned 200 to 250 guns per kilometer in breakthrough sectors, concentration unprecedented in military history. German defensive positions would not be suppressed, they would be obliterated. The reconnaissance in force began at exactly 4 o'clock as planned. Soviet assault battalions, reinforced infantry units with tank and artillery support, attacked German forward positions on narrow fronts across Army Group Center's line. These were not probing attacks in the traditional sense, but deliberate operations designed to force German defenders to reveal themselves. When German machine guns opened fire, Soviet forward observers marked their positions. When German mortars responded, counter-battery radars tracked their trajectories back to firing positions. When German artillery joined the engagement, sound-ranging equipment and aerial spotters triangulated gun locations. For 90 minutes, this deadly reconnaissance dance continued, as Soviet forces accepted casualties to map the German defensive system with precision. By 5:30, Soviet artillery commanders possessed detailed target folders showing every German bunker, machine gun nest, mortar pit, and artillery battery across breakthrough sectors. The real bombardment could now begin with surgical precision rather than blind saturation. At exactly 5 o'clock on the morning of June 23rd, the Katyusha rocket batteries opened fire. The decision to begin with rockets rather than conventional artillery was psychological warfare masquerading as military science. Katyusha, multiple rocket launchers called Stalin's organs, by terrified German troops, produced a sound unlike any conventional weapon. Each truck-mounted launcher carried 16 to 48 rails loaded with high explosive rockets that fired in rapid sequence, creating a howling shriek that Soviet psychologists knew induced panic even among veteran troops. Across the breakthrough sectors, over 1,000 Katyusha launchers fired simultaneously, their rockets streaking through the dawn sky, trailing smoke and screaming like banshees. The visual effect was as terrifying as the sound, hundreds of smoke trails converging on German positions, the rockets' red glare visible for miles. German soldiers emerging from night bunkers to morning watch positions looked up to see the sky filled with fire and had exactly seconds to seek cover before impact. The main artillery preparation began 5 minutes later at 5:05 and continued for 2 hours and 25 minutes, 145 minutes of systematic destruction executed with mechanical precision. The bombardment unfolded in carefully orchestrated phases. First came counter-battery fire as every identified German artillery position received concentrated attention from Soviet guns. This wasn't suppression fire, it was annihilation fire. German gun crews found their positions bracketed by salvos from multiple Soviet batteries simultaneously. Forward observers radioed corrections until German guns fell silent, destroyed, abandoned, or with crews killed. This phase lasted 40 minutes and effectively blinded German artillery, eliminating their ability to disrupt Soviet infantry assault when it came. Next came neutralization fire against German strongpoints, bunkers, and trench systems. Soviet gunners had rehearsed these missions against mock-ups of German fortifications constructed behind Soviet lines. They knew exactly which ammunition types to use: high explosive to collapse bunkers, shrapnel to clear trenches, phosphorus to create smoke and terror. The technical sophistication of Soviet artillery operations in 1944 would have been unrecognizable to artillery officers from 1941. Forward air controllers. Soviet Air Force officers trained in artillery coordination operated with ground units and could call in artillery strikes on targets of opportunity while simultaneously directing ground attack aircraft. Counter-battery radar, a technology barely functional in 1942, now provided real-time data on German gun positions. Sound-ranging equipment could triangulate enemy artillery locations within minutes. Aerial photography from the previous days had been annotated with grid coordinates that artillery observers could reference instantly. Most revolutionary was the double rolling barrage technique, developed specifically for Bagration. Two waves of artillery fire would advance ahead of Soviet infantry, at different speeds, a slow wave moving at infantry pace to suppress German defenders, and a fast wave leaping ahead to hit German reserve positions before they could counterattack. This technique required precision timing that Soviet artillery had never before attempted at this scale. German survivors of the Bagration bombardment left accounts that convey both the physical destruction and psychological trauma of modern artillery warfare executed with industrial efficiency. Lieutenant Wilhelm Lubeck, defending a bunker near Vitebsk, described the moment when Soviet fire found his position. The first salvo landed 30 meters short. The second hit directly on the bunker roof. I remember the sound of concrete cracking. Then nothing. I woke in darkness, with my ears bleeding, and the bunker collapsed around me. It took 3 hours to dig out. When I emerged, my company of 120 men no longer existed. I found 14 survivors in shell craters, all of them deaf, several bleeding from their eyes. Lubeck's experience was replicated thousands of times across German defensive positions that morning. Bunkers designed to withstand 75mm shells collapsed under sustained pounding from 152mm howitzers. Communications, trenches became mass graves as high explosive shells detonated among German soldiers moving to defensive positions. The ammunition expenditure during the Bagration artillery preparation exceeded the entire monthly production of German artillery shells. Soviet guns fired approximately 2.5 million rounds in the first 48 hours, more ammunition than the entire German army expended in June 1944 across all fronts. This expenditure was possible only because of the massive logistics preparation that had preceded the offensive. Ammunition trains had been arriving at forward depots for weeks, stockpiling shells in quantities that previous Soviet offensives could never sustain. American Studebaker trucks hauled ammunition from railheads to gun positions in continuous convoys. Each artillery battery had sufficient ammunition on hand to fire continuously for 72 hours without resupply. Soviet commanders had learned the brutal lesson that offensives failed when artillery ran out of shells. At the critical moment for Bagration, they ensured that moment would never come. German counter-battery fire, where it existed at all, made no appreciable impact on Soviet operations because the sheer volume of Soviet guns meant that destroying individual batteries was tactically meaningless. The physical transformation of German defensive zones during the bombardment was visible from Soviet observation posts. Forests were shredded to stumps by tree-burst shells designed to multiply shrapnel effect. Villages fortified by German engineers disappeared under sustained fire, wooden structures burned, stone buildings collapsed, entire defensive positions ceased to exist as recognizable terrain features. Smoke and dust created artificial fog that reduced visibility to meters. German soldiers attempting to man defensive positions found themselves moving through apocalyptic landscapes where familiar landmarks had been erased and coherent defensive lines reduced to isolated survivors in individual shell holes. Soviet artillery doctrine called this effect preparation of the battlefield, but the term understated the reality. What Soviet guns created was not a prepared battlefield, but a moonscape where organized defense had become impossible, and survival required luck more than skill. At 7:30 on the morning of June 23rd, the artillery fire shifted to rolling barrage as Soviet infantry assault waves rose from their positions and began advancing toward German lines. But the artillery did not cease. It moved ahead of the infantry at precisely calculated rates. Soviet artillery officers had marked their maps with phase lines indicating where fire should fall at specific times. As infantry reached each phase line, artillery fire lifted to the next line exactly 500 meters ahead. This technique kept German defenders suppressed right up to the moment Soviet infantry arrived, while preventing friendly fire casualties that had plagued previous offensives. German troops emerging from bunkers expecting to man defensive positions before Soviet infantry arrived, instead found Soviet soldiers already in their trenches, while artillery continued to fall on reserve positions behind them. The coordination between artillery and infantry, so disastrously absent in 1941, had become nearly perfect through 3 years of hard practice. As Soviet assault troops penetrated German forward positions, mobile artillery groups began their planned advance. These were not traditional artillery units that established firing positions and remained static. They were self-propelled guns and truck-towed howitzers trained to displace forward rapidly, establish hasty firing positions, provide fire support for advancing infantry, then displace again before German counter-battery fire could find them. This mobile artillery concept kept continuous fire support available for Soviet breakthrough forces, even as they advanced beyond the range of guns in original positions. German defenders who believed they had escaped the bombardment by retreating to reserve positions discovered that Soviet artillery could follow the advance and bring fire to bear within 20 minutes of receiving coordinates. The artillery offensive, a concept Soviet theorists had developed in 1943, had finally been realized. Artillery was no longer merely supporting infantry, but was itself an offensive weapon that could shape the battlefield and dictate the pace of operations. As morning turned to afternoon on June 23rd, and Soviet forces achieved breakthrough in multiple sectors, German commanders attempting to organize counterattacks found their assembly areas under artillery fire. German reserves moving forward encountered interdiction fire that destroyed vehicles and scattered formations. German command posts received concentrated strikes that killed staff officers and destroyed communication equipment. The symphony of destruction that had begun at dawn continued through the day and into the night, its tempo never slackening, its precision never wavering. Soviet artillery had become the Red Army's most devastating weapon, and it would continue firing for 67 days as Operation Bagration rolled westward toward Germany. The age of industrial warfare had reached its terrible apex on the fields of Belarus, and nothing in military history compared to the concentration of firepower that Soviet gunners had achieved. The Germans would learn that all their tactical skill, operational flexibility, and combat experience meant nothing when the ground itself was being systematically destroyed by thousands of guns firing millions of shells. The Symphony of Destruction had announced that the Eastern Front had fundamentally changed. The Red Army could now wage war on a scale and with a sophistication that Germany could no longer match. June 23, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning, Field Marshal Ernst Busch's headquarters, Minsk. The telephone call from General Georg Pfeiffer, commanding VI Corps near Vitebsk, was panicked despite Pfeiffer's attempt at professional composure. Soviet artillery had been falling for 4 hours. Communications with forward battalions had ceased. Entire defensive positions appeared to have been obliterated. Pfeiffer requested permission to withdraw VI Corps to secondary defensive lines before Soviet breakthrough forces encircled his formations. Busch, following Hitler's explicit orders, denied the request. Vitebsk was a Festerplatz, a fortress city that must hold regardless of circumstances. The troops would fight where they stood. Pfeiffer's response crackled through bad connection. Herr Feldmarschall, if we do not withdraw now, VI Corps will be destroyed. Busch repeated his orders and terminated the call. 5 days later, Pfeiffer would be captured along with 45,000 of his soldiers. The conversation represented German command dysfunction in microcosm field commanders, requesting tactical flexibility, higher headquarters, enforcing ideological rigidity, and reality preparing to destroy both. The German command structure facing Operation Bagration bore little resemblance to the flexible, adaptive system that had conquered France and nearly defeated the Soviet Union in 1941. 3 years of Hitler's increasing interference had transformed Wehrmacht command culture from professional military organization into feudal system, where loyalty trumped competence and ideology, overruled tactical sense. Busch exemplified the new Wehrmacht leadership: personally brave, tactically competent at lower levels, strategically incompetent, and pathologically obedient to Hitler's will. Appointed to command Army Group Center in October 1943, Busch had never commanded formations larger than a corps before receiving responsibility for 43 divisions. His chief qualification was political reliability. He was known to never question orders from the Führer. Now, that unquestioning obedience would cost him his command and destroy the army group he led. As Soviet breakthroughs multiplied across his front on June 23rd, Busch found himself paralyzed between what tactical reality demanded and what Hitler's doctrine forbade. The Festerplatz doctrine sealed Army Group Center's fate before the first Soviet shell fell. Hitler's concept of fortified cities that would anchor the defensive line made theoretical sense. Strong points that Soviet forces could not simply bypass would force the Red Army to conduct time-consuming siege operations that would slow their operational tempo. In practice, the doctrine created death traps. 5 cities received Festerplatz designation: Vitebsk with 4 divisions, Orsha with 2 divisions, Mogilev with 1 division, Bobruisk with 3 divisions, and Minsk with assorted security and training units. These garrisons totaled approximately 90,000 men, nearly 20% of Army Group Center's combat strength, who were ordered to hold their positions regardless of encirclement. Hitler's directive was explicit. Fortress commandants who requested permission to break out would be court-martialed. Troops who attempted unauthorized withdrawal would be shot for desertion. The cities would be defended to the last man and last bullet. What Hitler failed to understand, or refused to acknowledge, was that immobile garrisons without mobile reserves to support them weren't anchors. They were gifts to an enemy who could simply bypass them and continue advancing. Soviet breakthrough operations on June 23rd exceeded even optimistic Soviet planning assumptions. First Baltic Front under General Bagration achieved penetration of German defenses north of Vitebsk by mid-morning, advancing 8 kilometers in the first 6 hours. Third Belarusian Front under General Chernyakhovsky broke through south of Vitebsk simultaneously, creating a pincer movement that threatened to encircle the city and its garrison of 40,000 men. Second Belarusian Front's attack toward Mogilev initially encountered stronger resistance, but achieved breakthrough by afternoon. First Belarusian Front under Rokossovsky executed his controversial 2-thrust attack against German positions around Bobruisk. Both thrusts achieved penetration by early afternoon, validating Rokossovsky's argument against Stalin. By nightfall on the first day, Soviet forces had created 4 separate breakthrough sectors, each between 8 and 15 kilometers deep, across Army Group Center's defensive line. German tactical reserves, the battalion and regimental reserves that might have sealed these penetrations, had been destroyed by artillery or committed piecemeal to stemming breakthrough, and had simply been overrun. The German command response on June 23rd revealed an organization already losing coherence. Bush spent the morning attempting to contact Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia for permission to evacuate the Festerplatz cities. He couldn't reach Hitler. The Führer was in Berchtesgaden and unavailable. Bush spoke instead with General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, who reiterated existing orders: the fortress cities would hold. Requests for mobile reserves were denied. The panzer divisions were committed in Normandy or positioned in Ukraine, where they couldn't be extracted and moved north in less than a week. Requests to withdraw to prepared secondary defensive lines were refused. Hitler's standing order forbade voluntary retreat from occupied Soviet territory. By afternoon, when the scale of Soviet breakthrough became undeniable, Bush was reduced to issuing orders that his subordinates knew were impossible to execute: hold current positions, launch local counterattacks, prevent Soviet exploitation. These orders might have been appropriate against a limited Soviet attack. They were fantastically inadequate against an offensive employing 2.5 million men across a 700-mile front. The encirclement of Vitebsk unfolded with the mechanical precision of a well-rehearsed execution. Soviet forces advancing north and south of the city ignored German requests for local truces and simply flowed around Vitebsk's defensive perimeter. By June 25th, just 48 hours after the offensive began, Soviet pincers met west of Vitebsk, trapping 53,000 German troops in a pocket approximately 20 kilometers in diameter. General Pfeiffer, commanding the encircled forces, radioed Bush, requesting immediate permission to break out westward while a corridor still existed. Bush radioed Hitler's headquarters. Hitler's response arrived within hours. Vitebsk would be held as a fortress. General Pfeiffer would defend to the last man. Any commander who abandoned his position would be court-martialed for treason. The response included promotion. Hitler named Pfeiffer commander of a Festerplatz, as though the title would provide divisions that didn't exist. Pfeiffer, a professional soldier who understood military reality, gathered his senior officers and informed them they would attempt breakout regardless of orders. The attempt began on the night of June 26th. The Vitebsk breakout attempt demonstrated the difference between German tactical prowess and the strategic impossibility of their situation. Pfeiffer organized his remaining forces, perhaps 40,000 combat-effective troops, into breakout columns that would punch westward through Soviet encirclement lines under cover of darkness. The attack achieved initial surprise, German assault troops penetrating several kilometers through Soviet positions. For a few hours, escape seemed possible. Then Soviet reserves arrived, fresh divisions that had been held in depth specifically for this eventuality. Soviet aircraft, operating in daylight with total air superiority, strafed German columns. Soviet artillery, guided by forward observers in constant radio contact with fire direction centers, turned escape routes into killing grounds. By June 27th, the breakout had collapsed. Pfeiffer was captured. Approximately 8,000 German troops successfully escaped the pocket out of an original garrison of 53,000. The remaining 45,000 were killed or captured in 3 days of fighting. Hitler's Westerplatz doctrine had just consumed an entire corps for no strategic gain. Vitebsk fell anyway, only after its garrison had been uselessly sacrificed. The collapse accelerated across Army Group Center's front throughout late June, as Soviet operational momentum proved unstoppable. At Bobruisk, the German garrison of 40,000 troops found itself encircled by June 27th, when Rokossovsky's two thrusts met west of the city. The fortress commander requested permission to break out. Hitler ordered him to hold. The Bobruisk garrison attempted breakout on June 29th without authorization. Soviet forces, anticipating the attempt, had positioned blocking forces across all escape routes. The breakout became massacre. German columns were destroyed piecemeally by Soviet armor and air attack. 16,000 Germans escaped, 24,000 were killed or captured. At Mogilev, the garrison of 12,000 held until July 3rd, when ammunition exhausted and Soviet forces stormed the city center. The pattern repeated at each Westerplatz. Hitler ordered defense to the last man. Garrisons attempted last-minute breakouts when their situation became hopeless. Soviet forces systematically destroyed weakened formations attempting to escape. By early July, Army Group Center had lost 5 major cities and approximately 130,000 troops from fortress garrisons alone. The destruction of German mobile reserves completed Army Group Center's catastrophe. Whatever limited Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions Bush could scrape together were committed piecemeal against Soviet breakthroughs in desperate attempts to seal gaps that were already operationally irrelevant by the time German reserves arrived. Soviet exploitation forces had already advanced dozens of kilometers beyond the breakthrough sectors. The 12th Panzer Division was committed near Vitebsk on June 24th, advanced into a Soviet ambush, and lost 70% of its armor in 6 hours. The 20th Panzer Division counterattacked toward Bobruisk on June 26th and was destroyed by Soviet air attack before engaging Soviet ground forces. The 5th Panzer Division, transferred from Army Group North Ukraine, where it had been waiting for the offensive that never came, arrived in Belarusia on June 28th and was immediately encircled by Soviet mobile groups that had already advanced past the positions it was supposed to defend. German mobile reserves, the operational tool that had made Blitzkrieg possible, were being consumed in tactical emergencies like water poured on sand. Field Marshal Walther Model replaced Bush on June 28th, when Hitler finally acknowledged that Army Group Center faced catastrophe. Model was Germany's premier defensive expert, the Führer's fireman, who specialized in stabilizing collapsing fronts. He arrived at Army Group Center headquarters, reviewed the situation, and delivered a brutally honest assessment to Hitler by telephone. Army Group Center had lost approximately 300,000 men in 5 days. 31 divisions had ceased to exist as organized formations. Soviet forces were exploiting westward at will, with no coherent German defensive line to stop them. Model requested immediate authority to conduct fighting withdrawal to defensible positions, evacuation of all remaining Westerplatz garrisons, and transfer of 20 divisions from other army groups to prevent complete collapse. Hitler approved the first 2 requests. Model was one of the few commanders whose military judgment Hitler still trusted, but denied the third. There were no 20 divisions available. Model understood that his mission was not to save Army Group Center, but to delay its complete destruction long enough for Germany to scrape together forces to defend the Reich's eastern border. The death of Army Group Center was already accomplished fact. Model could only manage the terminal phase. By June 30th, 1 week after Operation Bagration began, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had been revolutionized. Soviet forces had advanced between 100 and 150 kilometers across a 400-kilometer-wide front. The German defensive line in Belarusia no longer existed as continuous formation. Only scattered battle groups, isolated garrisons, and disorganized stragglers remained between Soviet spearheads and the pre-war Polish border. Army Group Center had suffered casualties exceeding those of Stalingrad in 1/4 the time. 28 of its 34 divisions were destroyed or combat ineffective. German High Command faced nightmare scenario. The Red Army advancing toward Germany itself, with momentum that seemed unstoppable, and German mobile reserves already committed and destroyed. Hitler's ideology had collided with Soviet operational art, and ideology was losing catastrophically. The death of Army Group Center would continue for another 3 weeks as Soviet forces pursued westward, but the decisive blow had been struck in the first 7 days when German command rigidity, defensive inadequacy, and ideological blindness combined to create military disaster unprecedented in Wehrmacht history. What remained was pursuit, exploitation, and the terrible accounting of defeat. June 24th, 1944, 11 o'clock in the morning, 15 kilometers west of Bobruisk. Colonel Nikolai Chuprov's forward tank brigade was advancing faster than Soviet operational plans had anticipated. His lead battalion had covered 35 kilometers in the past 12 hours, remarkable speed considering they were advancing through forested terrain with limited roads and facing sporadic German resistance. Chuprov stood in the commander's cupola of his 34 and studied the map draped across the tank's engine deck. German defensive positions that intelligence had marked as heavily fortified were simply bypassed if a German strongpoint blocked the main road. Chuprov's tanks crashed through adjacent forests on parallel routes, while infantry following behind reduced the position. His radio crackled constantly with reports from subordinate commanders, encountering scattered German units attempting to organize defenses. The orders Chuprov issued were identical in every case. Don't stop to fight, bypass, and continue advancing. Let follow-on forces deal with resistance. The Soviet operational concept called this exploitation, the rapid advance of mobile forces through gaps created by breakthrough operations, and it was working better than even optimistic planners had imagined. The Soviet tank armies, committed to Operation Bagration, represented a revolutionary approach to armored warfare that synthesized lessons learned from 3 years of mobile operations against German forces. These weren't merely collections of tank brigades, they were combined arms formations with organic infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support integrated into the command structure. 5th Guards Tank Army under Marshal Rotmistrov and 2nd Guards Tank Corps under General Berdany were the primary exploitation forces for Bagration, held in reserve during breakthrough operations and committed only after Soviet rifle divisions had penetrated German defenses to depth sufficient for tanks to operate. This sequencing infantry breaks through, tanks exploit prevented the costly frontal assaults on prepared positions that had destroyed Soviet armor in 1941 and 42. By June 24th, both tank armies were unleashed through gaps that Soviet rifle divisions had torn in German lines, and they were now racing westward with orders to advance until fuel or ammunition exhausted. The operational technique Soviet tankers employed was deceptively simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. Tank brigades advanced in columns along multiple parallel routes rather than concentrating on main highways where German reserves would expect them. When resistance was encountered, lead tanks would suppress enemy fire, while follow-on companies maneuvered around flanks. If a position proved too strong for immediate assault, entire brigades would simply bypass it, and continue advancing. The position would be marked on maps and reported to following rifle divisions who would reduce it when they arrived hours later. This bypass technique was psychological warfare as much as tactical doctrine. German troops manning strongpoints discovered that Soviet tanks weren't attacking them but were simply driving past, heading deeper into German rear areas. The realization that one's defensive position had become irrelevant, that the battle had moved on, induced panic that static defensive positions couldn't create. The tank descent technique represented Soviet acceptance of brutal arithmetic in pursuit of operational speed. Rather than waiting for truck-mounted infantry to keep pace with tank advances, Soviet motorized rifle battalions simply rode on the tanks themselves. 8 to 12 infantrymen would cling to handholds welded onto 34 hulls and turrets, exposed to fire but moving at tank speed. When the column encountered resistance, infantry would dismount under fire and assault defended positions, while tanks provided mobile fire support. Casualties among tank-riding infantry were predictably high. Men fell from tanks when hit by fire, were crushed when dismounting during sudden stops, or were killed by artillery that targeted tank formations. Soviet commanders considered these losses acceptable because tank descent enabled exploitation forces to advance 30 to 40 kilometers per day, rather than the 15 kilometers that traditional infantry tank coordination could achieve. Speed was worth casualties, and Operation Bagration was designed for speed above all. Night movement separated Soviet exploitation from anything previously attempted on the Eastern Front. Traditional military doctrine held that armored formations should harbor at night, consolidate positions, refuel and rearm, then resume advance at dawn. Soviet operational planning for Bagration rejected this orthodoxy based on calculation that resting at night would allow German forces to establish defensive positions that would slow the next day's advance. Orders therefore specified continuous operations tank columns would advance through darkness using headlights, accepting navigation difficulties and increased fuel consumption in exchange for maintaining momentum. The first night movement operations on June 24th to 25th shocked German commanders who had assumed Soviet forces would harbor after dark. Instead, German troops attempting to establish defensive positions after dark found themselves overrun by Soviet tanks, advancing with lights blazing, apparently indifferent to ambush risk. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers realized they faced enemy who valued speed more than security, operational objectives more than tactical caution. The bridge capture operations demonstrated the sophistication of Soviet operational planning and the initiative of junior officers executing those plans. Soviet intelligence had identified every major bridge across the rivers that cut through Belarus, the Dvina, Berezina, Drut, and dozens of smaller waterways that could channel armor advances. The operational plan assumed Germans would demolish these bridges during their retreat, forcing Soviet engineers to conduct time-consuming bridging operations. To prevent this, Soviet forward detachments, reinforced companies of tanks and motorized infantry, were tasked with seizing bridges intact through coup de main operations. On June 26th, Guards Lieutenant Pavel Rotmistrov's company achieved one of the most spectacular successes when they advanced 60 kilometers in 12 hours, bypassed German defensive positions, and seized the bridge at Seno on the Drut River through surprise assault before German engineers could demolish it. The bridge was critical. It provided 5th Guards tank army with direct route to Minsk that avoided time-consuming detours. Rotmistrov held the bridge for 8 hours against German counterattacks until follow-on forces arrived, was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, and opened a corridor that German defensive planning had assumed wouldn't exist. Soviet mobile groups operating ahead of main tank formations represented yet another innovation in operational art. These were battalion-sized forces, typically 20 to 30 tanks with mechanized infantry support that advanced 10 to 20 kilometers ahead of main columns to provide reconnaissance and seize key terrain before German defenders could occupy it. Mobile groups operated with remarkable independence, often losing radio contact with higher headquarters for hours as they penetrated deep into German rear areas. Their mission was to create chaos rather than hold ground. They would appear unexpectedly at German supply dumps and destroy fuel stocks, attack headquarters compounds and kill staff officers, seize road junctions, and prevent German reserves from forward deployment. The mobile groups accepted high casualties in exchange for disruption effect disproportionate to their size. German commanders attempting to organize coherent defense found their rear areas swarming with Soviet armor that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike quickly, then vanish before German security forces could respond. The logistics challenge of sustaining rapid exploitation initially threatened to stall Soviet operations in late June. Tanks consume fuel at prodigious rates. A 34 required approximately 400 liters of diesel per 100 kilometers of movement, meaning a tank brigade advancing 40 kilometers per day needed 16,000 liters daily just for movement, plus additional fuel for combat operations. 5th Guards Tank Army, advancing from Bagration toward Minsk, had pushed beyond supply range of its forward fuel dumps by June 28th and was in danger of immobilization despite achieving unprecedented operational success. The crisis was resolved through emergency airlift operations, C-47 transport aircraft, supplied to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, flew fuel drums directly to advanced airfields that Soviet forces had captured. 400 tons of fuel were delivered by air over 48 hours, enough to keep tank armies mobile until ground supply lines could extend forward. The operation demonstrated Soviet logistical flexibility, but also highlighted vulnerability of deep exploitation operations to supply disruption. The human cost of exploitation operations was rarely discussed in Soviet operational reports, but was substantial. Tank crews operated under conditions of extreme fatigue. 72 hours of continuous operations was standard, with crews sleeping in shifts while halted for refueling. Mechanized infantry riding tank descente suffered casualty rates approaching 50% in some units. Vehicle losses from mechanical breakdown often exceeded combat losses as tanks were driven beyond maintenance schedules. Chuprov's brigade, which had begun Bagration with 62 tanks, counted 31 operational vehicles on June 30, 17, destroyed in combat, 14 broken down from mechanical failure. But Soviet operational planning anticipated these losses and had positioned replacement tanks in depth. Chuprov's brigade received 20 new 34s on July 1st and resumed advance the next day. Personnel losses were replaced from rifle divisions left behind during exploitation infantry who had fought through German defensive zones were now reassigned to tank army infantry units. The Soviet system had become mechanized in more than just equipment. It could ingest casualties and mechanical losses and continue operating at tempo that German forces couldn't match. By June 30th, Soviet exploitation forces had achieved what German commanders considered impossible: penetration to operational depth exceeding 200 kilometers in 7 days. Chuprov's brigade, advancing from Bagration, had covered 180 kilometers and was approaching Minsk from the southeast. Other Soviet columns advancing from north and south were converging on the Belarusian capital from multiple directions. German Army Group Center no longer possessed coherent defensive line, only scattered battle groups attempting to delay Soviet advance at river crossings and road junctions. The exploitation phase of Operation Bagration had succeeded beyond Stalin's expectations, beyond Zhukov's operational planning, beyond what Soviet tank commanders themselves had believed possible. The speed of Soviet advance was now dictating operational tempo. German defensive planning couldn't keep pace with Soviet movement. German reserves couldn't reach threatened sectors before Soviet forces had already passed through. And German high command was reacting to situations that were already hours out of date by the time orders were issued. The breakthrough had become pursuit. Pursuit was becoming rout, and the destruction of Army Group Center was entering its final phase as Soviet tank armies approached Minsk and prepared to close the ultimate encirclement that would trap over 100,000 German troops. The race to Minsk would determine whether those troops could escape or whether they would join the growing total of German soldiers killed or captured in the greatest military disaster in Wehrmacht history. July 3, 1944, 16 kilometers east of Minsk. Soviet Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov stood on the turret of his command tank and observed through binoculars as elements of his 5th Guards Tank Army linked up with 2nd Guards Tank Corps advancing from the north. The junction point was a crossroads village whose name he would later forget. What mattered was the operational reality this link-up represented. Soviet armored pincers had just closed west of Minsk, trapping 12 German divisions in an encirclement pocket approximately 40 kilometers in diameter. Rotmistrov checked his map and did quick mental arithmetic. 105,000 German troops were now cut off from westward escape, surrounded by Soviet forces that had covered 220 kilometers in 10 days. The Minsk pocket was forming exactly as Soviet operational plans had specified, but with one critical difference: the encirclement had occurred 3 days ahead of schedule. German Army Group Center, already shattered by the initial breakthroughs, had now suffered strategic catastrophe from which recovery was impossible. Rotmistrov radioed Stavka with the situation report that would be transmitted directly to Stalin. The ring around Minsk was closed. The German forces trapped in the Minsk pocket represented the remnants of what had been Army Group Center's operational reserve and second-line defensive forces. 4th Army Headquarters under General Kurt von Tippelskirch commanded the encircled forces, which included parts of 9 infantry divisions, 2 security divisions, and assorted artillery and support units. These were not the elite formations that Germany had committed to defending the initial breakthrough sectors. Those units had been destroyed in place during the first week of fighting. The Minsk pocket contained rear echelon troops, headquarters personnel, supply units, and shattered remnants of divisions that had retreated westward ahead of Soviet advance. Many of these soldiers were already demoralized from 7 days of constant retreat, short on ammunition and fuel, disconnected from higher command. Now they were surrounded 100 kilometers behind what had been the front line just 10 days earlier. German military tradition held that encircled forces should form hedgehog defenses and hold until relief forces broke through to them. But relief forces didn't exist. Field Marshal Model had nothing left to commit to breakout operations. The Minsk pocket would have to save itself or die. Soviet encirclement doctrine had been refined through 3 years of hard experience with German Kesselschlacht tactics, the cauldron battles that had destroyed Soviet armies in 1941. By 1944, Soviet commanders understood the essential elements of successful encirclement: establish inner containment ring to prevent breakout, establish outer containment ring to prevent relief, reduce pockets systematically using artillery and air power while conserving infantry. For Minsk, 1st Belarusian and 3rd Belarusian fronts established the inner ring with approximately 20 rifle divisions, 200,000 troops positioned in defensive perimeters, facing inward toward the pocket. The outer ring extended another 30 to 40 kilometers west, manned by mobile groups and fresh rifle divisions with orders to block any German relief attempts. Soviet operational planning assumed the pocket would require 10 to 14 days to reduce systematic artillery bombardment, would destroy German defensive cohesion, air attacks would prevent supply and reinforcement, then Soviet infantry would assault weakened positions and compress the pocket until organized resistance collapsed. The Luftwaffe's attempted aerial resupply of the Minsk pocket demonstrated both German desperation and Soviet air superiority's decisive impact. German transport aircraft, primarily Ju-52 trimotors, attempted supply drops beginning July 4th, flying from airfields in Poland loaded with ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. The first mission encountered Soviet fighter patrols that destroyed 14 of 23 transport aircraft before they reached the drop zones. Subsequent missions suffered similar losses. Soviet Yak-9 fighters operated in continuous patrols over the pocket, vectored to intercept German transports by ground controllers who could monitor Luftwaffe radio frequencies. The few German aircraft that penetrated Soviet air defenses discovered that drop zones were under Soviet artillery fire supply containers that landed in German-controlled areas were often hit by shells before they could be recovered. By July 7th, the Luftwaffe had lost 62 transport aircraft, attempting to supply the Minsk pocket while delivering less than 10% of the ammunition and fuel that encircled forces required. Goering personally ordered cessation of supply missions. The losses were unsustainable, and the operational effect negligible. The Minsk pocket would receive no relief from the air. Inside the encirclement, German command structure was disintegrating as rapidly as tactical cohesion. General von Tippelskirch's 4th Army headquarters had lost most of its communications equipment during the retreat to Minsk, and now communicated with subordinate divisions via motorcycle courier, a system that introduced hours of delay into tactical decision-making. Division commanders attempting to organize perimeter defense discovered their units were hopelessly intermixed companies from different regiments, battalions from different divisions, all jumbled together by 7 days of chaotic retreat. Ammunition was critically short. Artillery units reported having sufficient shells for perhaps 2 days of defensive fire. Fuel exhaustion had immobilized most vehicles, turning the mechanized Wehrmacht into a footbound force. Food was adequate for perhaps 1 week. Medical supplies were depleted, leaving thousands of wounded with inadequate treatment. Tippelskirch understood his situation with cold clarity. The pocket could not hold indefinitely, relief was not coming, and immediate breakout was the only option that offered survival for any significant portion of his command. The German breakout attempt began on the night of July 5th to 6th, when Tippelskirch ordered all mobile units to concentrate on the western edge of the pocket for breakthrough operation, aimed at smashing through Soviet inner containment. Ring. Approximately 40,000 troops participated in the assault. These were the units still sufficiently organized and equipped to conduct offensive operations. The attack achieved initial surprise. German assault groups penetrating 4 to 5 kilometers through Soviet positions in darkness. For a few hours, escape seemed possible. Soviet rifle divisions manning the inner ring were thinly spread. 20 divisions containing a 40-kilometer diameter pocket meant that each division held approximately 6 kilometers of front, far too thin for defense in depth. German breakthrough forces exploited gaps between Soviet defensive positions and surged westward. Then, Soviet operational reserves arrived. Tank brigades that had been held behind the inner ring specifically for this eventuality moved forward and engaged German columns at point-blank range. Soviet artillery, pre-positioned with overlapping fields of fire, turned likely breakout routes into killing zones. Most devastating were Soviet ground attack aircraft. Il-2 Sturmovix appeared at dawn and systematically destroyed German columns in the open. By midday on July 6th, the breakout had collapsed. Perhaps 8,000 Germans successfully escaped the encirclement. 32,000 were killed or captured during the attempt. The remainder retreated back into the contracting pocket. The systematic reduction of the Minsk pocket over the following days demonstrated Soviet operational competence that would have been unimaginable in 1941. Rather than launching costly infantry assaults against German defensive positions, Soviet commanders employed artillery and air power to methodically destroy organized resistance. Every German strongpoint identified by reconnaissance received concentrated artillery fire until it ceased to exist. Soviet infantry advanced only after artillery preparation had eliminated coherent defense. The pocket contracted at approximately 3 to 5 kilometers per day, slow enough to minimize Soviet casualties, fast enough to prevent German forces from reorganizing effective defense. German troops attempting to surrender discovered that Soviet treatment of prisoners varied wildly depending on which units captured them. Frontline rifle divisions generally accepted surrenders and processed prisoners, according to military convention. But NKVD and SMERSH units, following behind combat troops, were less concerned with Geneva Convention niceties. Soviet soldiers who had liberated villages and discovered German atrocities during the occupation were not inclined toward mercy. The mass surrender of German forces in the Minsk pocket occurred between July 9th and 11th, when organized resistance finally collapsed. General Vincenz Müller, commanding 12th Corps, surrendered his entire formation, 20,000 troops, on July 9th, becoming the highest-ranking German officer yet captured on the Eastern Front. His surrender triggered cascade effect, as other German units recognized continued resistance was futile. By July 11th, Soviet forces had captured 105,000 German prisoners from the Minsk pocket, along with 500 tanks and self-propelled guns, 2,000 artillery pieces, and vast quantities of equipment. The prisoners were marched east toward collection points where they would be processed, interrogated, and eventually transported to POW camps in Soviet interior. German casualties from killed and wounded approached 35,000, meaning that of the approximately 140,000 Germans trapped in the pocket, fewer than 15% successfully escaped. The Minsk encirclement had destroyed what remained of German Army Group Center's combat power, and demonstrated that Soviet operational art had achieved sophistication equal or superior to German capabilities. The liberation of Minsk on July 3rd, hours before the encirclement closed, provided Soviet propaganda with powerful symbolism. The Belarusian capital had endured 3 years of brutal German occupation that killed tens of thousands of civilians and reduced much of the city to ruins. When Soviet tank units entered Minsk from the north and south on the morning of July 3rd, they found streets lined with civilians who had hidden in cellars during the final days of fighting. The scenes were captured on film by Soviet combat cameramen residents emerging from rubble, Soviet flags being raised over public buildings, German prisoners being marched through streets they had occupied for 3 years. Stalin ordered maximum publicity for Minsk's liberation. Within 72 hours, newsreel footage was being shown in Soviet cinemas. Radio broadcasts were trumpeting the victory, and newspapers were publishing celebratory editorials. The contrast with 1941 was deliberate. Minsk had fallen in the first week of the German invasion. Its recapture 3 years later marked the definitive turn of the war's tide. As the Minsk Pocket's reduction concluded in mid-July, Soviet forces were already advancing westward past the Encirclement, pursuing shattered remnants of Army Group Center toward the pre-war Polish border. The operational pause that German planners hoped the Minsk Encirclement would provide time to establish new defensive positions and rebuild combat power never materialized because Soviet forces didn't pause. Tank armies that had closed the Encirclement simply passed it by, leaving reduction of the pocket to rifle divisions while mobile forces continued exploitation operations. This operational tempo, sustaining continuous advance while simultaneously reducing encircled forces, represented capabilities that no previous army had demonstrated. The Minsk Cauldron had consumed an entire German army in less than 2 weeks, killed or captured 140,000 troops, demonstrated Soviet operational superiority decisively, and still not slowed the Soviet advance westward. German Army Group Center had not merely been defeated, it had been obliterated as an organized fighting force, its tactical formations destroyed, its command structure shattered, and its strategic position collapsed beyond any possibility of restoration. What remained of the war in the east would be pursuit operations as Soviet forces advanced toward Germany itself, and the Minsk Encirclement stood as proof that Wehrmacht military supremacy on the Eastern Front had definitively ended. June 25, 1944, a forest road 30 kilometers east of Bobruisk. Private Benno Ziesser crouched in a drainage ditch and tried to count how many men from his company remained alive. 36 hours earlier, his unit's 2nd Company, 505th Infantry Regiment, had numbered 180 men defending prepared positions. Now Ziesser counted 12 soldiers huddled in the ditch with him, all that remained after Soviet breakthrough forces had overrun their defensive line. The company commander was dead, killed by artillery during the initial bombardment. The platoon leaders were missing, presumably dead or captured. The senior surviving NCO, a sergeant whose name Ziesser had forgotten in the chaos, was attempting to lead survivors westward through forests that seemed filled with Soviet patrols. They had no radio, no contact with higher headquarters, no clear idea where friendly lines might be. Ziesser was 20 years old, had been on the Eastern Front for 8 months, and was now experiencing something no Wehrmacht training had prepared him for. The complete disintegration of military organization and the transformation from soldier to refugee, the psychological shock of rapid defeat, affected German soldiers differently depending on their combat experience and ideological commitment. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front since 1941 recognized Bagration as categorically different from previous Soviet offensives. The speed, coordination, and relentlessness suggested an enemy that had learned all the lessons Wehrmacht had taught and added innovations Germans couldn't match. These veterans became grimly focused on survival, abandoning equipment and positions without authorization when tactical situations became untenable. Younger soldiers, particularly those who had arrived in the East after Stalingrad and still believed German propaganda about inevitable victory, experienced cognitive dissonance that sometimes manifested as paralysis. They stood at their posts awaiting orders that never came, manned defensive positions that Soviet forces had already bypassed, and clung to military routine even as the army around them dissolved. The most ideologically committed SS troops and convinced National Socialists sometimes fought with suicidal determination in hopeless situations, but more often their ideological certainty simply evaporated when confronted with overwhelming material reality. The physical experience of being overrun by Soviet forces left German survivors with trauma that many could never adequately articulate. Lieutenant Hans von Lendorf, a medical officer whose field hospital was overrun on July 1st, described the moment when Soviet tanks appeared among his tents. We had perhaps 200 wounded men who could not be evacuated. I was performing surgery when I heard tank engines. I stepped outside and saw 334s driving directly through the hospital compound, crushing tents with wounded men inside. Soviet infantry, following the tanks, began shooting anyone in German uniform, wounded or not. I hid in a cellar with 2 nurses for 12 hours. When we emerged, 140 of our patients were dead, some from the tank attack, others shot where they lay in their beds. I cannot explain why the Russians did not kill us when they found us. Perhaps they had satisfied their vengeance and had moved on to other concerns. Lehndorff's account was one of thousands that painted a picture of warfare that had transcended military professionalism and entered the realm of racial vengeance. The few successful German breakout operations from Encirclements demonstrated that tactical excellence still existed within Wehrmacht formations, but excellence without strategic context was merely prolonging the inevitable. Colonel Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, commanding a battle group built around remnants of Grossdeutschland Panzer Division, found himself encircled near Minsk on July 8th with approximately 2,000 troops and 30 operational tanks. Strachwitz, one of Germany's most decorated panzer commanders, organized a night breakout that exploited Soviet overextension. His tankers had identified a gap between Soviet rifle divisions in the encirclement ring and concentrated all available armor for breakthrough at that point. The attack achieved complete surprise, Strachwitz's battle group smashing through Soviet positions before reserves could arrive. His force advanced 60 kilometers westward in 8 hours and linked up with German rear echelon units attempting to establish defensive lines. Strachwitz evacuated 1,500 troops. Casualties of 500 during the breakout were considered acceptable losses for escaping encirclement. But his success was tactical anomaly rather than operational model. Most German units lacked the leadership, cohesion, and equipment to execute similar operations, and even Strachwitz's victory merely delayed his soldiers' ultimate fate. The treatment of German prisoners by Soviet forces varied so wildly that generalizations became impossible. Regional commanders, unit histories, and recent combat experiences all influenced whether German troops would be processed according to Geneva Convention or shot where they stood. German prisoners captured by regular Red Army rifle divisions generally received military treatment, disarmament, interrogation, transportation to POW camps. Survival rates for these prisoners were relatively high, approximately 85% living through captivity and eventually returning to Germany in the 1950s. German troops captured by partisan units, NKVD formations, or Soviet units that had just liberated villages where German atrocities had occurred faced grimmer prospects. Summary executions of SS troops were routine. Wehrmacht soldiers, identified as having participated in anti-partisan operations, were often shot immediately. The discovery that German forces had burned villages with inhabitants inside a common German pacification technique frequently triggered Soviet retribution against any German prisoners in the vicinity. Soviet military leadership made no particular effort to prevent these killings. Red Army soldiers who had witnessed 3 years of German brutality were not inclined toward mercy. The Moscow Victory Parade of July 17th became the defining image of German defeat for audiences worldwide. Stalin personally ordered the parade as demonstration to Western allies that Soviet forces were bearing the primary burden of defeating Germany. 57,000 German prisoners from the Bagration Encirclements were assembled in Moscow and marched through city streets in carefully choreographed columns, while Soviet citizens watched and cameras rolled. The prisoners presented haggard appearance after weeks in temporary camps, dirty uniforms, unshaven faces, limping gaits, but they were identifiably Wehrmacht soldiers, and their numbers made undeniable statement about the scale of German defeat. The parade route was designed for maximum symbolic impact. Prisoners marched past the Kremlin, where Stalin and other Soviet leadership watched from reviewing stands, then through central Moscow streets lined with Soviet civilians who had endured years of privation. The deliberate humiliation was international propaganda coup. Newsreel footage was distributed globally, appearing in American and British cinemas within days. Western audiences who had focused on D-Day suddenly confronted visual evidence that Soviet forces were destroying entire German armies in the East. Personal letters written by German soldiers during and after Bagration revealed psychological transformation from confidence to despair that mirrored the military situation. Gottlob Biedermann, a veteran of the Eastern Front since 1941, wrote to his wife on July 12th, "We have experienced something here that makes Stalingrad seem like a minor defeat. Entire divisions have simply ceased to exist. I no longer see how Germany can win this war, or even how we can avoid losing it catastrophically. The Russians have become better soldiers than we are. They coordinate their attacks better. Their supplies never run short. Their aircraft control the skies. We are fighting with weapons from 1941 against an enemy using equipment from 1944. Every day I survive is now a gift, rather than an expectation." German military censors reading such letters faced impossible choice. The letters were defeatist and should be suppressed according to regulations, but they accurately described military reality that suppression couldn't change. Many censors simply allowed letters through, recognizing that maintaining false optimism was pointless when families would soon learn the truth from other sources. The ritual of destroying unit colors to prevent their capture revealed how thoroughly German soldiers understood their situation had become hopeless. Wehrmacht tradition held that regimental and divisional flags represented unit honor and should be defended literally to the death. When units faced certain annihilation, commanders were required to burn their colors rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. Across the Bagration battlefield, this ritual played out hundreds of times during late June and early July. Officers gathered surviving soldiers, read from unit tradition books describing past glories, then burned silk battle flags while men stood at attention. For soldiers steeped in German military culture, these ceremonies represented acknowledgement that their formations were about to die and would leave no physical legacy. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had defined themselves as members of historic regiments now watched those identities literally go up in smoke. Some soldiers wept openly during these ceremonies. Others stood expressionless, beyond emotion, simply waiting for whatever came next. The emergence of ad hoc battle groups, Kampfgruppen, from the wreckage of destroyed divisions, represented German soldiers' attempts to impose order on chaos. When regiments ceased to exist as organized formations, surviving officers would gather any troops they encountered and form temporary units named after whoever commanded them. Kampfgruppe Müller might contain survivors from 6 different divisions, fragments of supply units, rear echelon personnel who had never trained for combat, even Luftwaffe ground crew whose airfields had been overrun. These improvised formations had no organic artillery, no established communications, no supply arrangements, just riflemen with whatever ammunition they carried, and orders to delay Soviet advance at whatever position could be defended. The Kampfgruppen fought with desperate courage that reflected soldiers' understanding that surrender might mean death and retreat had nowhere to go. They would hold river crossings for hours against overwhelming Soviet forces, then melt away into forests when their positions became untenable. These actions had tactical significance. Every hour's delay gave other German units time to retreat, but no strategic impact. The Kampfgruppen were fighting for time Germany no longer had. German soldiers attempting to retreat westward discovered that the civilian population they had occupied for 3 years was now an active threat. Belarusian partisans who emerged from forests as Soviet forces advanced frequently attacked German stragglers, ambushed retreating columns, and informed Soviet units about German movements. Civilians who had endured 3 years of occupation saw German retreat as opportunity for vengeance. German soldiers separated from their units were beaten, sometimes killed by civilians wielding farming implements. Wounded Germans abandoned during retreat faced grim prospects in villages where German occupation had left bitter memories. The ideological framework that had sustained Wehrmacht soldiers, that they were fighting subhuman Slavs who were naturally inferior, collapsed when those supposedly inferior people killed German soldiers with pitchforks and hunting rifles. Veteran NCOs began warning younger troops that capture by Soviet military forces was preferable to falling into civilian hands, advice that would have seemed absurd during the victorious advance of 1941, but was simple tactical reality in the catastrophic retreat of 1944. By mid-July, German soldiers across Army Group Center's former sector had coined a term that would enter Wehrmacht lexicon, the Weißrussische Abgrund, the Belarusian abyss. The phrase captured their perception that Bagration represented something worse than simple military defeat. It was descent into chaos, where familiar military conventions no longer applied. German tactical skill didn't matter when Soviet artillery destroyed positions before they could be manned. German operational flexibility didn't matter when Soviet tank armies advanced faster than German infantry could retreat. German fighting spirit didn't matter when ammunition exhausted, and relief forces didn't exist. The Belarusian abyss swallowed 300,000 German soldiers in 3 weeks, and transformed survivors into hollowed men who understood that Germany's war in the East was effectively over. What remained was not victory or honorable defeat, but simply varying speeds of collapse. German soldiers who had marched into Soviet Union in June 1941, singing songs of inevitable victory, now stumbled westward in July 1944, speechless with exhaustion and shock, retreating toward a homeland that would itself soon become battlefield. The face of defeat was their face dirty, unshaven, haunted by experiences they could never explain to civilians who had not witnessed the Belarusian abyss. And the question that many asked in those dark July days was not whether Germany would lose the war, but whether anyone would survive to see the loss. June 26, 1944, a railway repair site 40 kilometers east of Minsk. Major Anatoly Mereshko of the Soviet railway troops stood beside damaged track and calculated how long repairs would take. German engineers had demolished the rail line thoroughly. Explosives had torn up rails, destroyed crossties, and cratered the roadbed. Normal military practice would require 3 to 4 days to restore service. Mereshko's orders specified 24 hours. His railway battalion had been following the advancing Red Army with prefabricated bridge spans, replacement rails, and materials to convert German gauge track to Soviet gauge. They had repaired 70 kilometers of track in the past week, sometimes working within artillery range of the front lines. Now they faced perhaps their most critical mission, restoring the main Minsk railway line that would serve as the primary supply artery for Soviet forces exploiting westward. Mereshko's troops began work immediately, some surveying damage, while others unloaded materials from trucks. They would work through the night, accept casualties from occasional German artillery fire, and meet their deadline because Soviet operational planning demanded nothing less. The logistics miracle of Operation Bagration was unfolding along thousands of kilometers of railway, road, and forest trail, and it would prove as important to Soviet victory as the breakthrough operations themselves. The scale of Soviet logistics requirements for Bagration would have seemed fantastical to observers familiar with Red Army supply failures in 1941 and 42. 2.5 million men required approximately 100,000 tons of supplies, daily food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement equipment. First-line rifle divisions advancing into combat consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. Artillery units fired thousands of shells per day. Tank armies required hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel. Previous Soviet offensives had stalled when logistics collapsed after initial successes, advances that outran supply lines, ammunition stockpiles that exhausted within days, fuel shortages that immobilized mechanized units. Soviet planners studying these failures concluded that logistics capability, not combat power, limited operational depth. For Bagration, logistics received unprecedented attention during the planning phase. Stockpiles were established months in advance. Supply routes were mapped in detail. Transportation assets were allocated to ensure continuous flow of material. The result was a logistics system capable of sustaining operations across hundreds of kilometers for weeks without interruption. American Lend-Lease contributions to Soviet logistics capabilities were simultaneously massive and rarely acknowledged in Soviet accounts. 200,000 Studebaker trucks provided the backbone of Soviet tactical supply. These vehicles hauled ammunition from railheads to artillery positions, carried fuel to tank units, evacuated wounded from aid stations to hospitals. Soviet domestic truck production had never approached quantities necessary for modern mechanized warfare. Without American trucks, Soviet forces would have been dependent on horse-drawn transport, as in 1941. Beyond trucks, American contributions included telephone wire, field radios, canned food, leather boots, railway rolling stock, and 1,000 other items that modern armies require. Soviet commanders privately acknowledged this contribution. Marshal Zhukov later stated that, without American logistic support, we would not have had the capability for concentration and decisive actions, but public Soviet propaganda minimized Lend-Lease importance for political reasons. The truth was that Soviet operational art provided the tactical and operational concepts, while American industrial capacity provided significant portion of the logistics infrastructure, enabling those concepts' execution. The Soviet railway troops represented one of Stalin's most successful organizational innovations. These were military formations organized in battalions and brigades, commanded by officers, subject to military discipline but trained as railroad engineers rather than combat soldiers. By 1944, railway troops numbered over 400,000 personnel and had developed extraordinary expertise in rapid repair and conversion of captured railway infrastructure. German forces retreating across Belarus demolished every bridge and tore up track at every opportunity, attempting to slow Soviet pursuit by denying railway transport. Railway troops rendered these efforts largely ineffective by repairing damage faster than Germans could create it. They carried prefabricated bridge spans that could be installed in hours rather than days, required to construct bridges from scratch. They had developed techniques for converting German broad gauge track to Soviet standard gauge that required only moving one rail inboard work that took hours rather than days of complete reconstruction. During Bagration, railway troops repaired 7,800 kilometers of track in 6 weeks, an average of 186 kilometers per day, that represented construction rates unprecedented in military history. The fuel supply crisis that nearly halted Soviet tank armies in late June demonstrated both the sophistication of Soviet logistics and remaining vulnerabilities. Fifth Guards Tank Army, advancing toward Minsk, consumed approximately 800,000 liters of diesel fuel daily when conducting mobile operations. Supply convoys hauling fuel from railheads could deliver perhaps 60% of requirements. Under optimal conditions, the shortfall meant tank armies were perpetually operating on partial fuel loads and risked immobilization if supply lines were disrupted. On July 2nd, Soviet logisticians calculated that Fifth Guards Tank Army would exhaust fuel within 24 hours unless emergency measures were implemented. The solution was improvised but effective. American C-47 transport aircraft were diverted from normal supply missions to fly fuel directly to advanced airfields captured by Soviet forces. 400 tons of fuel, delivered in steel drums that were simply rolled out of cargo aircraft onto runways, arrived over 48 hours and kept tank armies mobile during the critical Minsk encirclement phase. The episode highlighted continuing Soviet dependence on fragile supply chains that could be disrupted by German spoiling attacks, or even by Soviet operational success that advanced faster than logistics could follow. Soviet field bakeries represented mundane but essential element of logistics system that sustained 2.5 million men in combat. Bread was staple of Red Army diet. Soviet soldiers required approximately 1 kilogram of bread daily, along with grain, porridge, tea, and occasional meat or fish. Industrial bakeries operated in Soviet rear areas, but bread baked 300 kilometers behind the front lines would be stale or moldy by the time it reached combat units. The solution was mobile field bakeries, truck-mounted ovens that advanced with combat units and baked bread daily, using flour hauled forward by supply convoys. These bakeries operated under combat conditions, sometimes within artillery range of German positions, staffed by military bakers who wore uniforms and carried weapons because rear areas in mobile warfare frequently became front lines without warning. During Bagration, Soviet field bakeries produced approximately 2,500 tons of bread daily, an industrial undertaking that received no publicity but was absolutely essential to maintaining combat effectiveness. The medical evacuation system demonstrated Soviet willingness to accept casualties that Western armies would have found intolerable, while also showing improvements in medical care from earlier war years. Soviet doctrine anticipated casualty rates of 5 to 8% during offensive operations, meaning Bagration planning assumed 125,000 to 200,000 casualties. These numbers required medical infrastructure capable of treating thousands of wounded men daily. Soviet medical battalions established aid stations within several kilometers of combat zones, where wounded received initial treatment, bleeding control, shock management, stabilization. Wounded who required surgery were evacuated to field hospitals, positioned 10 to 20 kilometers behind the lines. Soldiers requiring extended care were moved further rearward to base hospitals. The system prioritized rapid return to duty. Soldiers with minor wounds were treated and returned to their units within days. Soldiers with severe wounds, but good recovery prognoses, received care sufficient to survive, but often inadequate by Western standards. Soldiers whose injuries were catastrophic and survival prospects poor received pain management but limited resources. Soviet medical system made brutal triage decisions that Western medical personnel would have refused. Despite these harsh realities, Soviet medical care had improved dramatically from 1941, when wounded soldiers often died from lack of treatment. By 1944, approximately 70% of wounded Soviet soldiers survived, a percentage that reflected both better medical care and evolution of Soviet tactical doctrine that reduced some of the most catastrophic casualty-producing situations of early war years. Ammunition supply was simultaneously Soviet logistics system's greatest success and continuing vulnerability. Artillery ammunition was pre-positioned in vast dumps established during May and June, supplies sufficient for weeks of continuous operations. First-line rifle divisions carried substantial ammunition loads on their supply trucks. The challenge was maintaining supply as units advanced westward and distance from dumps increased. Soviet solution involved continuous forward movement of ammunition storage. As advancing units established control over new areas, supply units would move ammunition dumps forward, typically positioning them 30 to 50 kilometers behind current front lines. This system worked well as long as Soviet forces advanced steadily, but could be disrupted if German counterattacks threatened supply routes. German forces specifically targeted Soviet ammunition dumps with air attacks and long-range artillery when they could identify them, knowing that destroying ammunition stocks was more effective than engaging Soviet combat units. Soviet response involved dispersion rather than single, massive dumps that made lucrative targets. Ammunition was distributed across dozens of smaller sites that were harder to locate and less vulnerable to single attacks. The role of Soviet partisans in logistics operations extended beyond combat support to direct participation in supply distribution. Partisan-controlled areas in Belarus provided secure rear areas where Soviet forces could establish supply dumps without German interference. Partisans guided supply convoys through forest trails that German forces didn't know existed, shortening supply routes by tens of kilometers. Partisan workshops repaired Soviet vehicles and equipment using captured German tools and materials. Most importantly, partisans provided labor. Civilians from partisan-controlled villages were mobilized to help unload supply trains, carry ammunition forward, construct roads through forests. This civilian labor, often coerced rather than voluntary, multiplied Soviet logistics capacity by performing tasks that would otherwise have required military personnel. The ethical complications of this system were rarely discussed in Soviet accounts, but thousands of Belarusian civilians found themselves pressed into Soviet military service immediately after liberation from German occupation. Their labor as essential to Red Army operations as the soldiers' combat efforts. Engineer units solving bridging requirements represented another crucial element of Soviet logistics. Belarus's numerous rivers, the Berezina, Dvina, Drut, Svizlok channeled military operations and created bottlenecks where Soviet forces concentrated. German demolitions destroyed every permanent bridge during their retreat, forcing Soviet engineer units to provide temporary crossings. Soviet engineers had developed standardized pontoon bridge equipment that could support tank traffic and be assembled in hours. During Bagration's first 3 weeks, Soviet engineers constructed over 200 pontoon bridges across major water obstacles. These bridges required constant maintenance. Pontoons could be damaged by German artillery or air attack. Anchor cables could break under heavy traffic. Approaches could be washed out by rain. Engineer battalions assigned to bridge maintenance worked around the clock, accepting casualties from German interdiction fire while keeping supply routes open. Without these bridges, Soviet tank armies would have been forced to halt at each water obstacle, losing momentum that was essential to maintaining operational tempo. The mundane realities of logistics, trucks breaking down, fuel spilling from damaged drums, bread molding in summer heat, ammunition getting wet during thunderstorms, received no mention in Soviet victory communiques, but were constant concerns for logistics officers. Major Mereshko and thousands of officers like him spent the Bagration campaign solving prosaic problems that determined whether combat units could continue fighting. When trucks broke down, mechanics worked through the night to restore them to service or cannibalized parts from irreparable vehicles to fix others. When bridges collapsed under heavy traffic, engineers improvised fords or constructed bypass routes. When ammunition trains were delayed by German air attacks, supply officers reallocated stocks from less active sectors. The Soviet logistics system functioned not because it was perfectly designed, but because logistics personnel demonstrated initiative and problem-solving ability that Soviet military culture had historically suppressed, but was now essential to success. The logistics miracle of Operation Bagration was that Soviet forces sustained 100 kilometers of advance per week for 6 weeks, despite operating across damaged infrastructure, through hostile territory, under German air attack, and with supply lines stretching across distances that had defeated Soviet logistics in earlier war years. This achievement received none of the glory accorded to tank armies or breakthrough operations, but without it, those operations would have stalled within days. Soviet operational art had finally matched logistics capability to operational ambition, and that matching was as significant a military achievement as tactical victories on the battlefield. June 23, 1944. Dawn, 12,000 meters above Vitebsk. Luftwaffe pilot Hauptmann Heinz Nock banked his Focke-Wulf 190 and scanned the sky for the Soviet fighters he knew were hunting him. Nock was a decorated veteran with 42 confirmed kills, but those victories meant nothing against the tactical situation he faced this morning. His mission reconnaissance over Soviet breakthrough sectors was already failing. Soviet Yak-9 fighters had appeared within minutes of crossing the front line, forcing Nock into defensive maneuvering that prevented effective observation. He had counted at least 20 Soviet aircraft in the immediate vicinity and knew that was a small fraction of Soviet air power committed to Bagration. The Luftwaffe's 6th Air Fleet could muster perhaps 60 operational aircraft across the entire 700-mile front. Soviet Air Force had committed 6,000 aircraft to the offensive. The arithmetic was crushing. Nock radioed his wingman, whose aircraft had already taken hits from Soviet fighters, and ordered withdrawal toward German lines. The reconnaissance mission had provided no useful intelligence. Nock survived to file his after-action report, but the report's conclusion was stark. Luftwaffe had lost air superiority so completely that daylight reconnaissance over Soviet positions had become suicide mission. The transformation of Soviet Air Force from near-total destruction in 1941 to operational dominance by 1944 represented one of the war's most remarkable reversals. German air superiority during Operation Barbarossa had been so complete that Luftwaffe pilots joked about lack of opposition. Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could fly, shot down by the hundreds when they did take off, and so poorly coordinated that German fighters achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1. But Stalin had rebuilt Soviet aviation through combination of industrial evacuation that moved aircraft factories beyond German reach, ruthless purging of incompetent commanders, systematic analysis of German tactics, and American Lend-Lease support that provided raw materials Soviet industry couldn't produce domestically. By June 1944, Soviet Air Force fielded modern aircraft in overwhelming numbers, operated with tactical sophistication matching Luftwaffe standards, and benefited from operational planning that integrated air power with ground operations at levels of coordination that Luftwaffe, fractured by competing command chains, couldn't achieve. Soviet aircraft types committed to Bagration reflected 3 years of design evolution driven by combat experience. The Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft had become the symbol of Soviet tactical air power, heavily armored, mounting 23mm cannons and rockets, capable of destroying German tanks and strong points despite intense anti-aircraft fire. Sturmoviks flew in formations of 6 to 8 aircraft, approaching targets at low altitude to maximize accuracy, then climbing rapidly to evade German anti-aircraft response. German troops called them the Black Death and considered Sturmovik attacks more demoralizing than artillery bombardment because aircraft were visible, their approach was audible, and the psychological impact of low-altitude attack was profound. Soviet P-2 bomber aircraft provided medium-range strike capability, attacking German reserves, supply dumps, and command posts beyond frontline zones. Yak-9 and La-5 fighters achieved performance parity with German Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters, and were produced in quantities that allowed Soviet Air Force to sustain losses that would have grounded Luftwaffe formations. The coordination between Soviet ground forces and air units during Bagration represented revolutionary approach to combined arms warfare. Forward air controllers, Soviet Air Force officers trained in both aviation and ground combat, operated with Soviet rifle divisions and tank armies, carrying radios that communicated directly with aircraft overhead. When Soviet ground commanders identified targets requiring air support, German strongpoints holding up advance, counterattacking tank formations, artillery batteries, they could request airstrikes within minutes, rather than hours, required by traditional air-ground coordination procedures. This system, called aerial artillery in Soviet doctrine, effectively gave ground commanders ability to call fire from sky, just as they called fire from artillery batteries. The technique required extensive training for both ground controllers and pilots, strict radio discipline to prevent German interception, and air superiority sufficient to allow aircraft to loiter over battlefield waiting for target assignments. By June 1944, Soviet Air Force had achieved all these prerequisites. Soviet air operations on the first day of Bagration demonstrated the scale of air superiority Soviet forces had achieved. 4,000 sorties were flown on June 23, alone reconnaissance missions, mapping German defensive positions, fighter sweeps clearing German aircraft from operational areas, ground attack missions, destroying identified strongpoints, bomber strikes interdicting German reserves moving toward breakthrough sectors. This sortie rate exceeded total Luftwaffe capability across all fronts. The entire German Air Force could not have matched Soviet sortie generation on Bagration's first day if every German aircraft had been committed to Belarus. German anti-aircraft units found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers of targets. They could engage individual Soviet aircraft or formations, but couldn't prevent others from reaching targets. German troops on the ground, veterans who remembered Luftwaffe, air superiority from earlier war years, experienced psychological shock at seeing skies filled with Soviet aircraft while German planes were absent. The reversal of air superiority had profound morale impact beyond the physical destruction Soviet aircraft inflicted. Luftwaffe's 6th Air Fleet collapse during Bagration reflected broader institutional crisis affecting German air arm. Fuel shortages, limited training hours for new pilots, meaning replacements arrived at combat units with perhaps 50 flight hours versus 200 hours in earlier war years. Critical pilots were siphoned to defensive Reich duties, protecting German cities from American daylight bombing raids, took priority over supporting ground forces in the east. Aircraft production, though numerically adequate, couldn't deliver modern designs fast enough. Many Luftwaffe units still flew Bf-109 fighters designed in 1935 against Soviet aircraft, incorporating 1943 technology. Most critically, Luftwaffe command structure had fractured under competing priorities. Göring's Reich Air Ministry controlled strategic decisions. Frontline air fleets reported to Army Group commanders for tactical operations, and air defense forces operated under completely separate chain of command. This organizational chaos meant Luftwaffe couldn't mass forces effectively even when aircraft were available. 6th Air Fleet possessed on paper perhaps 250 aircraft at Bagration's start, but operational readiness rates below 25% meant only 60 planes could fly on any given day. The targeting of German airfields by Soviet Air Force demonstrated how air superiority could be self-reinforcing. Soviet bombers and ground attack aircraft struck Luftwaffe airfields systematically during Bagration's first week, destroying aircraft on the ground, cratering runways, and killing ground crews. German aircraft that survived initial strikes and retreated to airfields further west discovered those fields were also being attacked. Soviet operational reach now extended 150 kilometers beyond the front line. Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,000 aircraft during Bagration's first 3 weeks, two-thirds destroyed on the ground rather than in air combat. This pattern, attacking enemy air forces on the ground rather than waiting to engage them in air, was doctrine that Luftwaffe had employed devastatingly in 1941. By 1944, Soviet Air Force had adopted the technique and was executing it more effectively than Germans had, using overwhelming numbers to saturate defenses and persistent reconnaissance to locate dispersed German aircraft. German efforts to protect airfields by dispersing aircraft to field strips and camouflage sites reduced Soviet effectiveness somewhat, but couldn't prevent steady attrition of Luftwaffe combat power. Soviet strategic bombing operations, though less sophisticated than American or British efforts, complicated German defensive challenges. Soviet P-8 heavy bombers struck railway junctions, supply depots, and headquarters facilities across German rear areas throughout Bagration. These were not precision attacks. Soviet bomber crews lacked training and equipment for accurate bombing from high altitude, but they didn't need precision to disrupt German logistics. Bombs falling on railway yards destroyed some trains while forcing others to halt pending damage clearance. Attacks on supply dumps occasionally hit stockpiles, but more importantly, forced Germans to disperse logistics facilities, reducing efficiency. Headquarters facilities struck by Soviet bombers had to relocate, disrupting command and control during the critical period when coherent German response might have limited Soviet breakthrough. The cumulative effect of these attacks was German logistics network, operating at perhaps 60 to 70% efficiency, when 100% was insufficient to meet defensive requirements. The psychological dimension of Soviet air supremacy affected German ground forces as profoundly as the physical destruction Soviet aircraft inflicted. German soldiers who had advanced into Soviet Union in 1941 under protective umbrella of Luftwaffe air superiority now experienced what Soviet troops had endured: constant vulnerability to air attack, inability to move during daylight without risk of being strafed, the sound of aircraft engines producing instant fear. German veterans described the experience as transformative. Tactical situations that would have been manageable with friendly air cover became catastrophic when Soviet aircraft could attack unopposed. Road marches that should have taken hours stretched to days as units scattered into forests whenever Soviet aircraft appeared. Artillery positions that should have been able to fire for effect instead displaced constantly to avoid Soviet air attack. German commanders planning operations had to account for Soviet air interdiction as certain rather than possible factor, which limited tactical options and slowed response times. Soviet pilot Ivan Kozydub, who would become highest-scoring Allied ace of World War II with 62 confirmed victories, flew combat missions over Belarus during Bagration, and later described the experience as target practice. Soviet pilots were now engaging German aircraft with numerical superiority, sometimes exceeding 20-1, which meant Luftwaffe pilots faced impossible tactical situations regardless of their skill. When German fighters appeared increasingly rare as Bagration progressed, they were immediately swarmed by Soviet fighters who could afford to accept losses because replacement aircraft were arriving constantly. German aces who had achieved high victory totals in earlier war years now found themselves flying defensive missions, simply trying to survive rather than hunting enemy aircraft. Kozydub's victory total during Bagration included several German aircraft shot down while attempting to bomb Soviet forces, meaning German bombers could operate only when escorted by fighters who were themselves outnumbered and fighting for survival. The close air support provided by Il-2 Sturmovix during Soviet breakthrough operations achieved a tactical effect that ground forces alone couldn't have produced. When Soviet rifle divisions encountered German strongpoints holding up advance, forward air controllers could vector Sturmovix to the target within 15 to 20 minutes. The aircraft would arrive in formations of 6 to 8, make multiple attack passes using cannons and rockets, then climb away before German anti-aircraft could engage effectively. German defensive positions subjected to these attacks suffered both physical destruction and psychological trauma. Soldiers experienced the terror of being targeted by aircraft they couldn't effectively engage, watching as comrades were killed by weapons against which foxholes provided inadequate protection. Soviet ground commanders considered Sturmovik support so valuable that forward air controllers became essential members of division staffs, their role in combat operations equal to artillery or armor coordinators. By mid-July, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over Soviet-controlled Belarus had effectively ceased. German commanders attempting to assess Soviet dispositions, identify reserve concentrations, or plan counterattacks operated without aerial intelligence that was essential to modern warfare. This blindness compounded every other German disadvantage. Soviet forces could see German movements through constant aerial reconnaissance, while German forces could only guess at Soviet intentions. The intelligence disparity meant Soviet commanders made decisions based on current battlefield information, while German commanders operated on assumptions, rumors, and information that was hours or days out of date. When German counterattacks failed, as nearly all of them did during Bagration, the failures often stemmed from attacking positions based on obsolete intelligence, engaging forces that had already moved, or walking into Soviet ambushes that German reconnaissance might have detected had aircraft been available. The loss of air superiority had transformed every German tactical operation into a gamble where Germans fought with partial information against an enemy who could see the entire battlefield. Soviet air supremacy during Operation Bagration was as decisive as artillery superiority, tank superiority, or any other measurable factor. It represented categorical advantage that Germans couldn't overcome through tactical skill or operational flexibility. The sky belonged to the Red Air Force, and from that sky, Soviet pilots could observe, interdict, and destroy German ground forces while protecting their own troops from the diminishing Luftwaffe threat. The transformation from 1941's German air superiority to 1944's Soviet dominance was complete, visible, and absolutely fatal to German defensive prospects. German soldiers looking skyward saw their own impotence, reflected in contrails from Soviet aircraft flying unopposed, and they understood that whatever tactical successes they might achieve on the ground were tactical irrelevances in a battle where the enemy controlled the vertical dimension absolutely. July 4, 1944. Soviet cameraman Yevgeny Khalday walked through newly liberated Minsk with his Leica camera and photographed scenes that would define how the world understood Operation Bagration. Khalday was no amateur documentarian. He had been covering the Eastern Front since 1941, had developed sophisticated eye for images that conveyed both factual information and emotional resonance. This morning he photographed Soviet tanks rolling through Minsk's central square, while civilians emerged from cellars to witness their liberation. He photographed destroyed German equipment littering streets, burned-out trucks, abandoned artillery pieces, discarded weapons. Most powerfully, he photographed the faces of Minsk's residents, old women weeping, children staring with hollow eyes, men embracing Soviet soldiers. These images would appear in Soviet newspapers within 48 hours, would be compiled into documentary films within weeks, and would become the visual narrative of Soviet victory. What Khalday didn't photograph, and what Soviet propaganda carefully excluded, were the NKVD units following the combat troops, the summary executions of suspected collaborators, the forced conscription of military-age men. The propaganda war was as carefully orchestrated as the military campaign, and Stalin understood that controlling the narrative was as important as controlling the battlefield. The Soviet Information Bureau, Sovinform had been established in June 1941 as the official source for war news, and had evolved into sophisticated propaganda organization by 1944. Daily communiques, released by Sovinform followed standardized format, precise casualty figures for German forces, specific numbers of captured equipment, names of liberated cities, decorations awarded to heroic soldiers. The precision was deliberate statistics, created impression of factual objectivity that made Soviet claims seem credible. Throughout Bagration, Sovinform released bulletins announcing destruction of German 12th Corps, capture of 250 tanks, liberation of Vitebsk with 45,000 prisoners. These numbers were generally accurate. Soviet military intelligence had become proficient at casualty accounting, but the framing emphasized German losses while minimizing Soviet casualties. Red Army losses were mentioned only in passing, if at all, and always in heroic rather than tragic context. Soviet soldiers who died became fallen heroes of the motherland rather than casualties. Soviet retreats were planned withdrawals when they occurred. Soviet setbacks were simply not reported. The decision to stage the Moscow Victory Parade on July 17th was Stalin's personal order and represented propaganda masterstroke. Western media attention had focused heavily on D-Day and Allied operations in Normandy, creating perception in America and Britain that Western allies were leading the fight against Germany. Stalin recognized this narrative threatened Soviet post-war negotiating position if Western populations believed British and American forces were primarily responsible for defeating Germany. Soviet territorial demands and political influence in post-war Europe would face skepticism. The Victory Parade was designed to correct this misperception through visual demonstration that Soviet forces were destroying German armies at scale that dwarfed Western Front operations. 57,000 German prisoners from Bagration Encirclements were transported to Moscow and assembled for march through city center. The logistics of moving that many prisoners, organizing them into columns, and choreographing their route through Moscow required extensive planning, but Stalin considered it effort well spent. The parade itself was designed for maximum symbolic and propagandistic impact. German prisoners were organized by rank and unit, with generals and senior officers marching at the front, where cameras could capture their humiliation. The route deliberately passed the Kremlin reviewing stand, where Stalin and Soviet leadership watched, a staging that emphasized the reversal of power relationships. Germans who had expected to conquer Moscow now marched as prisoners before Soviet masters. Soviet citizens lined the parade route. Attendance was not mandatory, but was strongly encouraged by party officials, and their reactions were captured on film. Some crowds were silent, others jeered, a few threw objects at prisoners. The controlled chaos created visual narrative of German defeat and Soviet triumph. After prisoners passed, water trucks washed the streets in symbolic cleansing that Soviet propagandists claimed represented washing away the German filth. Western media coverage of the Moscow parade achieved Stalin's objective. The New York Times headline read, 57,000 Nazi prisoners paraded in Moscow, greatest defeat ever inflicted on German army. The London Times published front-page photographs of German generals marching in captivity. American newsreels showed footage to audiences who suddenly understood that, while Allied forces in Normandy were fighting to break out of their beachhead, Soviet forces were destroying entire German armies and liberating territory the size of France. Churchill privately worried that the parade would shift Western public opinion toward viewing Soviet Union as the dominant Allied power, concern that proved well-founded, as polls showed significant increase in American respect for Soviet military capability following the parade. Stalin had successfully used Bagration's victories to reframe global perception of who was winning the war against Germany. German propaganda response to Bagration revealed an organization paralyzed by inability to acknowledge catastrophe while maintaining domestic morale. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, faced impossible task. German public needed to be informed about Eastern Front disasters. Casualties were too extensive to conceal when tens of thousands of families received death notices, but couldn't be told the full truth without triggering morale. Collapse. The solution was verbal gymnastics that transformed disasters into euphemistic, strategic adjustments. Official Wehrmacht communiques describing Bagration avoided words like defeat, retreat, or catastrophe. Instead, they reported elastic defense, fighting withdrawal to prepared positions, and successful disengagement from untenable salients. The destruction of Army Group Center became reorganization of Eastern Front defensive lines. The loss of Minsk was framed as evacuation of forward positions to shorten supply lines. German civilians reading these communiques recognized the kana euphemisms for what they were, lies that indicated something terrible was happening, but official propaganda maintained the fiction. The ban on accurate reporting about Bagration within Germany created information vacuum that rumor filled immediately. German soldiers on leave from Eastern Front brought first-hand accounts of catastrophe that contradicted official propaganda. Families receiving death notices or learning loved ones were prisoners understood the official narrative was false. Foreign radio broadcasts, particularly from BBC and Swiss sources, provided more accurate information that German civilians could access despite prohibitions. Goebbels recognized the danger. Rumors often portrayed situations as worse than reality, and uncontrolled information flow could trigger panic. His solution was to gradually acknowledge defeats while framing them as temporary setbacks caused by Allied material superiority, rather than German military inadequacy. German propaganda began emphasizing that Germany faced entire world in arms, that Soviet victories resulted from American supply support, that German soldiers were fighting heroically against impossible odds. This narrative maintained that German cause was noble, even if victory was increasingly doubtful, a messaging shift that indicated Goebbels understood outright victory claims had lost credibility. Soviet documentation of German atrocities in liberated Belarus served both propaganda and legal purposes. NKVD and Smersh units following combat troops systematically photographed evidence of German war crimes, burned villages with civilian remains, mass graves, concentration camp facilities. Soviet photographers under military direction created visual archive that would eventually contribute to Nuremberg prosecution evidence. But in immediate term, these images served propaganda function by providing justification for Soviet treatment of German prisoners and legitimizing Soviet territorial demands. Soviet newspapers published photographs of atrocities, with captions emphasizing that German occupation had murdered 2.3 million Belarusian civilians. Soviet documentary films included footage of German crimes discovered during liberation. The message to Soviet civilians was clear: Germans deserve no mercy. The message to Western allies was that Soviet suffering justified Soviet demands for post-war security arrangements that would prevent future German aggression. The Western Allied response to Bagration propaganda was complicated by strategic considerations. British and American military intelligence recognized that Soviet offensive had achieved unprecedented success and had destroyed German combat power on scale that exceeded Normandy operations. Churchill and Roosevelt both sent congratulatory messages to Stalin, acknowledging Soviet achievements. But Western media coverage was more restrained than Soviet propaganda desired. American newspapers continued focusing primarily on Pacific Theater and Normandy campaign, treating Bagration as important but secondary story. This coverage pattern reflected Western editors' judgment about what interested their audiences, but it frustrated Soviet propaganda officials, who believed Western media was deliberately minimizing Soviet contributions. The tension between Soviet desire for recognition and Western media priorities created friction that would persist through war's end and contribute to post-war suspicions that eventually hardened into Cold War antagonism. Soviet internal propaganda emphasized heroic individual soldiers and commanders who exemplified socialist military virtues. Sovnformbureau released profiles of tank commanders who destroyed multiple German vehicles, infantry officers who captured German strongpoints single-handedly, artillery gunners whose accuracy destroyed German batteries. These stories followed standard formula. Hero from working class or peasant background joined Red Army to defend motherland, fought with extraordinary courage, achieved specific measurable success, was awarded military decoration. The profiles served multiple purposes. They provided human interest stories that made abstract military operations personally compelling. They reinforced Communist Party narrative that socialism produced superior soldiers, and they created role models that encouraged emulation. Whether these heroic accounts were entirely factual was secondary to their propaganda value. Soviet military culture had always blended reality and idealization, and by 1944, the system was highly refined. The suppression of negative information within Soviet propaganda created sanitized version of Bagration that excluded uncomfortable truths. Soviet casualties, somewhere between 60,000 and 180,000, depending on how deaths, wounded, and missing were counted, were rarely mentioned in detail. Incidents of Soviet soldiers committing atrocities against German prisoners or Belarusian civilians suspected of collaboration were never reported. Forced conscription of liberated populations received no coverage. Strategic setbacks, when they occurred, were either not reported or were reframed as tactical adjustments. This sanitization was so complete that Soviet citizens reading Pravda or watching newsreels would have concluded Bagration was nearly bloodless victory achieved through military genius and socialist superiority. The reality that victory came through massive material superiority, acceptable casualty rates that Western armies would have found intolerable, and operational art that had been learned through catastrophic defeats was airbrushed from the narrative. Soviet propaganda's treatment of American Lend-Lease support revealed tensions in Soviet messaging. On one hand, Soviet propaganda acknowledged Allied cooperation and emphasized unity against fascism. Stalin needed continued American support and couldn't afford to alienate Western public opinion. On the other hand, Soviet propaganda minimized American material contributions to maintain narrative that Soviet victory resulted from socialist superiority rather than capitalist supply. The compromise was to acknowledge Lend-Lease in general terms, while avoiding specifics about scale or significance. Soviet newsreels might show Studebaker trucks in background of combat footage, but wouldn't explain that those trucks were American-supplied. Soviet communiques would thank Allied assistance without quantifying that assistance or acknowledging that Soviet logistics would have collapsed without it. This careful threading of needle reflected Stalin's understanding that Soviet prestige required minimizing visible dependence on capitalist aid, while political reality required not antagonizing the source of that aid. By late July 1944, the propaganda war around Bagration had achieved Stalin's strategic objectives. Global perception had shifted to recognize Soviet Union as major, perhaps primary Allied power defeating Germany. Western media, initially skeptical of Soviet military capabilities, now reported Soviet operations with respect approaching awe. German propaganda had been forced to acknowledge defeats that undermined Nazi narrative of inevitable victory and Aryan superiority. Soviet domestic population had received carefully crafted message that the Red Army was invincible and that final victory was assured. What Soviet propaganda had created was not necessarily accurate historical record that would await decades of archival research and memoirs from participants, but was powerfully effective narrative that shaped how contemporaries understood the war. The photographs Yevgeny Kalday took in Minsk, the prisoner parade through Moscow, the casualty figures released by Sovinformbureau, the documentary films distributed to theaters across Soviet Union and Allied nations, all combined to create propaganda triumph that matched the military triumph on battlefield. Stalin understood that wars are won both by armies and by narratives, and he was winning both battles simultaneously. The propaganda war around Operation Bagration was as carefully planned and ruthlessly executed as the military operation itself, and its success would influence post-war geopolitics in ways that military victories alone could never achieve. July 3, 1944. The outskirts of Minsk, Frida Riesman heard Soviet artillery in the distance and knew that 3 years of hiding were about to end. She was 23 years old, Jewish, and one of approximately 200 survivors from Minsk's pre-war Jewish population of 90,000. When Germans occupied the city in 1941, they had immediately established ghetto, then systematically murdered its inhabitants over the following 2 years. Frida had escaped the ghetto during a liquidation action, hidden in a Belarusian family's cellar, moved between partisan-controlled forests and sympathetic villages, and survived through combination of courage, deception, and extraordinary luck. Now, Soviet tanks were entering Minsk, and liberation had finally arrived. But Frida's relief was complicated by fear. She emerged from hiding, wearing clothes that identified her as local civilian, unable to prove she hadn't collaborated with Germans, uncertain whether Soviet authorities would view her survival itself as evidence of collaboration. Liberation, she would discover, was not simple restoration of pre-war normalcy, but rather transition from one brutal reality to another that was marginally less immediately lethal, but still profoundly dangerous. The scale of German atrocities in Belarusia exceeded even Soviet expectations, and Soviet forces liberating the Republic discovered killing sites that shocked veterans hardened by 3 years of Eastern Front warfare. Mali Trostenets, a death camp near Minsk, had been established by SS in 1942 as extermination facility. Soviet investigators entering the site on July 4th found evidence that 6,500 people had been murdered there, predominantly Jews from Belarus and from countries across occupied Europe, transported to Trostenets specifically for killing. The Germans had attempted to destroy evidence before retreating, burning bodies and demolishing structures, but enough remained for Soviet documentation teams to reconstruct what had occurred. The photographs taken at Trostenets, mass graves, gas van remains, partially burned bodies would become evidence at Nuremberg trials. But in immediate aftermath of liberation, these discoveries fueled Soviet soldiers' rage and desire for vengeance that would be inflicted on any Germans who fell into Soviet hands. Belarusian civilian population had suffered proportionally the highest losses of any Soviet republic during German occupation. Of 9.2 million pre-war population, approximately 2.3 million had died, 25% mortality rate that exceeded even Ukraine's catastrophic losses. 209 cities and towns had been destroyed, along with 9,200 villages. The Germans had implemented deliberate policy of destruction, burning villages suspected of supporting partisans and murdering inhabitants as collective punishment. The massacre at Katyn, where German security forces burned 149 villagers alive in March 1943, was not unique but rather one of hundreds of similar atrocities. Soviet forces liberating villages across Belarusia discovered ruins where communities had existed, forests where villages had stood, silence where children's voices should have been heard. The devastation was so complete that rebuilding would require decades, and the psychological trauma would persist for generations. The Soviet treatment of Belarusian civilians during liberation reflected NKVD priorities that placed security concerns above humanitarian considerations. As combat troops advanced westward, NKVD units followed behind and established filtration camps, where civilians were processed to determine loyalty or collaboration. All adult males between ages 18 and 55 were required to report to these camps for interrogation. NKVD interrogators attempted to identify individuals who had served in German-sponsored police forces, worked in German administration, informed on partisans, or otherwise collaborated with occupation authorities. The definition of collaboration was broad, and arbitrarily applied. Someone who worked as translator for Germans might be shot as collaborator, while someone who provided food to German troops might be assessed as having acted under duress. The interrogations were brutal, often involving torture to extract confessions. Summary executions of suspected collaborators occurred daily, typically without trial or appeal, based on NKVD officers' judgment of guilt. The forced conscription of military-age men immediately upon liberation represented Soviet manpower needs overriding humanitarian concerns. Red Army had suffered enormous casualties during 3 years of war and required constant replacement personnel. Liberated Belarusian men between 18 and 45 were considered eligible for military service regardless of their physical condition, family situation, or personal circumstances. NKVD units conducting filtration also conducted conscription men who passed loyalty screening, were issued uniforms and assigned to reserve divisions that followed behind combat units. Many of these conscripts had survived 3 years of German occupation and partisan warfare, only to be immediately pressed into Soviet military service. Training was minimal, perhaps 2 weeks before assignment to combat units. Equipment was whatever was available. Life expectancy for these replacements was measured in weeks once they reached frontline service. Soviet military culture viewed this system as necessary sacrifice for victory. Individual circumstances were irrelevant compared to collective needs. Jewish survivors like Frieda Reisman faced particular complications during liberation. Soviet official ideology rejected ethnic identity in favor of class identity, which meant Soviet authorities did not specifically recognize Jews as distinct victim category. When Jews reported German persecution to Soviet officials, they were categorized as Soviet citizens rather than as Jews. This ideological position meant that Jewish suffering wasn't acknowledged separately from general Soviet suffering, which minimized the genocide's specific targeting of Jewish populations. Additionally, Jewish survivors faced suspicion because their survival itself raised questions: how did they survive when 95% of Belarusian Jews were murdered? NKVD interrogators sometimes assumed survival indicated collaboration, forcing Jewish survivors to prove they had hidden or fought with partisans rather than cooperated with Germans. The psychological cruelty of this treatment, Jewish survivors interrogated by Soviet officials who suspected them of collaborating with the regime that had attempted to exterminate them, was profound. Partisan fighters transitioning from resistance to Soviet military service discovered that their 3 years of autonomous operations had created suspicions rather than gratitude from Soviet authorities. Partisans had operated with substantial independence, governed their own territories, made tactical decisions without Moscow's approval. This independence conflicted with Soviet preference for rigid hierarchical control. NKVD conducted extensive interrogations of partisan commanders to determine whether any had cooperated with Germans, exceeded authority, or committed crimes against Soviet citizens. Some partisan leaders who had fought Germans effectively for years were arrested by NKVD during liberation on charges of unauthorized actions or political unreliability. The most successful partisan commanders, those who had demonstrated initiative and leadership, were often viewed most suspiciously because their independence suggested they might resist party authority in peacetime. The result was that many partisans who expected recognition for their resistance instead faced interrogation and sometimes imprisonment. The phenomenon of Soviet soldiers exacting personal vengeance on German prisoners occurred frequently enough to concern Soviet military leadership, but not frequently enough to trigger systematic intervention. Red Army soldiers liberating villages where German atrocities had occurred sometimes killed German prisoners in retaliation, particularly if those prisoners were identified as having participated in anti-partisan operations. Soviet officers aware of these killings generally did not intervene unless the killings became so widespread as to undermine military discipline. Commissars and political officers who normally enforced ideological conformity considered revenge killings understandable response to German atrocities, and typically filed reports describing German prisoners as having been shot while attempting to escape, when actually they had been executed. The scale of these reprisal killings is impossible to determine accurately. Estimates range from several thousand to tens of thousands of German POWs killed outside official processes during and after Bagration, but the phenomenon was widespread enough that German soldiers understood surrender to Soviet units that had recently liberated atrocity sites was likely to be fatal. Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman, accompanying Red Army during Bagration, wrote diary entries that captured the moral complexity of liberation. Grossman was Jewish himself, had lost his mother to German murder squads in Ukraine, and initially felt satisfaction at German defeat. But he became increasingly uncomfortable witnessing Soviet behavior during liberation. The summary executions, forced conscriptions, and casual brutality toward civilians suspected of collaboration. One diary entry from July 1944 described watching NKVD officers execute 3 Belarusian civilians accused of collaboration. They were shot without trial, based on neighbors' denunciation, which may have been motivated by personal grudge rather than genuine collaboration. Is this liberation, or merely exchanging one tyranny for another? I cannot celebrate this as pure victory. Grossman's writings would later contribute to his political persecution in Soviet Union. The party did not tolerate suggestion that Soviet liberation involved moral ambiguity. The destruction of Belarusian infrastructure during German retreat complicated liberation's humanitarian challenges. Germans had implemented scorched earth policy as they retreated, destroying anything that might be useful to advancing Soviet forces. Railways were demolished, bridges blown, power stations destroyed, water treatment facilities rendered inoperable. Civilians emerging from hiding or returning from partisan forests discovered their homes burned, their fields mined, their communities reduced to rubble. Food supplies were critically short. German forces had confiscated agricultural output for 3 years, and many Belarusian farmers had been unable to plant crops during final year of occupation due to combat operations. Soviet authorities attempting to feed liberated population while simultaneously supplying advancing army faced impossible logistics challenges. Food distributions were inadequate, leading to malnutrition that killed additional thousands of civilians who had survived the occupation. Disease spread rapidly through populations weakened by years of hardship and now living in unsanitary conditions among ruins. The psychological trauma of occupation and liberation would affect Belarusian society for generations, in ways that Soviet ideology struggled to accommodate. Survivors carried memories of atrocities that official Soviet narrative preferred to subsume into general narrative of Great Patriotic War, rather than acknowledge as specific Jewish genocide or Belarusian suffering. Children who had witnessed German massacres grew up with psychological scars that Soviet medical system, which barely acknowledged concept of psychological trauma, couldn't treat. Communities that had been destroyed physically were also destroyed socially. The bonds of trust that held villages together had been shattered by 3 years of informing, collaboration, accusations, and survival decisions that involved compromising with evil. Soviet authorities expected liberated populations to immediately embrace socialist reconstruction and demonstrate gratitude for liberation, but many civilians were too traumatized, hungry, and bereaved to perform the enthusiasm that party officials demanded. The liberation of Belarusia represented simultaneously a genuine liberation from genocidal occupation and an imposition of Soviet system that Belarusians had not necessarily chosen. The German occupation had been catastrophically murderous, over 2 million dead, infrastructure destroyed, economy shattered, society traumatized. Soviet liberation ended the immediate threat of extermination and restored some measure of security. But Soviet system brought its own repressions, forced collectivization, political conformity enforced by NKVD, suppression of Belarusian national identity in favor of Soviet identity, economic policies that prioritized Soviet needs over Belarusian welfare. Civilians who had hoped liberation would restore pre-war normalcy discovered that both the Germans and Soviets viewed Belarusia primarily as strategic territory to be controlled, rather than as homeland of people with their own aspirations. Frida Reisman survived German occupation, survived Soviet liberation, emigrated to Palestine in 1946, and spent the rest of her life trying to process what liberation had actually meant: freedom from immediate death threat, but not freedom in any broader sense. Her story, and the stories of millions of other Belarusians who experienced liberation in July 1944, revealed that the end of German occupation was beginning of Soviet occupation, and that the category of liberation was more complicated than propaganda suggested. The joy of survival was real, but it coexisted with grief for those who hadn't survived, fear of new authorities who might prove dangerous, and recognition that the suffering wasn't actually over, but had merely changed forms. July 13, 1944, the pre-war Polish-Soviet border near Grodno. Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Karpov stood beside his tank and studied the wooden frontier post that marked where Soviet territory ended and Poland began. 3 years earlier, this border represented the limit of Stalin's expansion following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the line where Soviet and German spheres of influence met after both powers had dismembered Poland. Now, Soviet forces were crossing it again, but circumstances were entirely different. In September 1939, Soviet troops had entered Poland as invaders, claiming to protect ethnic minorities. In July 1944, they crossed as liberators pursuing defeated German armies. The distinction mattered legally and politically, Stalin insisted. Soviet forces were liberating Poland from German occupation rather than conquering Polish territory. But Karpov understood the reality that Polish population would grasp immediately. Soviet forces were returning to territory they had occupied before, and Polish independence was not high on Stalin's priority list. He climbed back into his tank and ordered his battalion to advance westward. The drive to the Vistula was beginning, and whether Poles viewed Soviet arrival as liberation or occupation would be determined by events over the coming weeks. The strategic rationale for continuing operations beyond Belarusia's liberation reflected Stalin's determination to position Soviet forces as far west as possible before war's end. The destruction of Army Group Center had created operational vacuum across eastern Poland. German defensive lines no longer existed. Reserve formations had been destroyed or committed to containing breakthroughs, and panic was spreading through German command structure. Soviet operational planning recognized this as opportunity that might not recur. If Soviet forces halted at pre-war Soviet-Polish border, Germans would gain time to establish defensive positions, transfer divisions from other fronts, and stabilize the situation. But if Soviet forces maintained operational tempo and exploited westward immediately, they could potentially advance another 300 to 400 kilometers before German defenses congealed. The prize was the Vistula River, Poland's major geographic obstacle that offered natural defensive line. Soviet forces reaching the Vistula would position Red Army within striking distance of Germany's pre-war eastern border and would make Soviet Union the dominant power in Eastern Europe, regardless of how Western allies concluded their campaigns. The second phase of Bagration, often called the Lvov-Sandomierz operation, demonstrated Stalin's ambition by attacking simultaneously in Ukraine while continuing operations in Belarusia. First Ukrainian front under Marshal Konev, which had been conducting the massive deception operation that fooled German intelligence about Bagration's true target, launched its own offensive on July 13th. This attack was not feint, it was full-scale operation, employing 7 armies, over 1 million troops, and aiming to liberate western Ukraine while advancing toward Vistula from the south. The simultaneous offensives in Belarusia and Ukraine meant German high command faced catastrophe on 2 fronts simultaneously, neither of which could be reinforced without weakening the other. Hitler's nightmare scenario, multi-front collapse that overwhelmed German ability to respond, was becoming reality. German reserves rushed north to contain Bagration found themselves needed in south for Lvov offensive. Reserves committed south were immediately needed north. The paralysis was total. The speed of Soviet advance beyond Belarusia's borders shocked both Germans and Western allies. Between July 13th and August 1st, Soviet forces advanced approximately 400 kilometers from their Belarusian starting positions to the Vistula River near Warsaw. This represented average advance rate of over 20 kilometers per day, sustained for 19 consecutive days. Operational tempo that no previous army in military history had maintained over such distance and duration. Soviet tank armies were operating at limits of mechanical endurance. Logistical systems were stretched to breaking point. Rifle divisions were suffering casualties from exhaustion as much as from combat. But operational momentum was maintained through sheer force of will, replacement of casualties and equipment from depth, and exploitation of German disorganization that prevented effective defensive operations. Soviet commanders understood they were running race against German recovery. Every day of continued advance was day that Germany couldn't use to rebuild defenses. The liberation of Polish cities revealed tensions between Polish national aspirations and Soviet political objectives. Lublin, Poland's 6th largest city, was liberated by Soviet forces on July 23rd. Within days, Stalin had installed the Polish Committee of National Liberation, a communist-dominated provisional government that Poles derisively called the Lublin government as ostensible authority in liberated Poland. The committee's members were Polish communists who had spent the war in Moscow, had no popular support among Poles, and existed primarily to legitimize Soviet political control. The London-based Polish government in exile, which represented democratic Polish political traditions and enjoyed support from Western allies, protested that Lublin government was Soviet puppet. Churchill and Roosevelt both recognized this assessment was accurate, but were limited in their ability to respond. Soviet armies occupied Poland. Western armies were still fighting in France, and Stalin had no intention of allowing democratic Polish government that might resist Soviet influence. The liberation of Poland was simultaneously military operation and political takeover. The German response to Soviet breakthrough into Poland revealed an organization approaching psychological breaking point. Hitler, receiving reports of Soviet advances toward Warsaw, initially ordered Field Marshal Model to hold every inch of Polish territory. Model, who had replaced Busch as Army Group Center commander and was one of few German commanders whose military judgment Hitler still respected, responded with unprecedented bluntness. Army Group Center no longer existed as organized fighting force. German reserves had been consumed, and defensive operations in Poland were feasible only if Hitler authorized complete withdrawal from Baltic states, transfer of divisions from Western Front, and abandonment of fortified position doctrine. Hitler, remarkably, authorized most of Model's requests, indication that even he recognized the Eastern Front situation had become catastrophic. But the authorized transfers couldn't arrive quickly enough to prevent Soviet forces from reaching the Vistula. By the time German reinforcements deployed to Poland, Soviet tank armies were already establishing bridgeheads across the river. The Soviet Air Force's continued dominance during the drive to the Vistula provided critical support that enabled such rapid advances. Ground attack aircraft flew interdiction missions that destroyed German columns, attempting to retreat westward, cutting escape routes and forcing German units to surrender or be destroyed in place. Reconnaissance aircraft provided Soviet commanders with real-time intelligence on German defensive positions and troop movements. Fighter aircraft maintained air superiority that allowed Soviet ground forces to operate without fear of German air attack. The Luftwaffe, which had been ineffective during Bagration's initial phase, became virtually non-existent during the pursuit phase. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and airfield destruction had reduced German air presence to token resistance. Soviet pilots described the period as flying without opposition, a situation that would have seemed fantastical to anyone familiar with Luftwaffe's dominance in 1941. The human cost of sustained operations became apparent in casualty reports that Soviet commanders received with increasing frequency. Rifle divisions that had begun Bagration with authorized strength of 9,000 men now reported 4,000 to 5,000 effectives. Tank brigades had lost 60 to 70% of original strength to combination of combat losses and mechanical breakdowns. Casualties among junior officers, platoon, and company commanders approached 90% in some units due to German defensive tactics that specifically targeted Soviet leadership. But Soviet replacement system kept units operational by continuously feeding replacements forward from training divisions in the rear. New soldiers arrived at front lines with minimal training, were assigned to veteran units, and learned combat techniques through experience or death. The system was brutally efficient. Individual soldiers were expendable. Units continued operating. Offensive momentum was maintained. Western military observers studying Soviet operations were simultaneously impressed by operational effectiveness and appalled by casualty rates that British or American armies would have considered intolerable. The approach to Warsaw in late July created political crisis that would poison Soviet-Polish relations for decades. The Polish Home Army underground resistance, force loyal to London government in exile, had been planning uprising in Warsaw, timed to coincide with Soviet arrival. The plan assumed Soviet forces would support uprising, would quickly liberate the city, and would recognize Polish resistance fighters as legitimate partners in liberation. But Stalin had different objectives. He viewed Home Army as potential threat to Soviet control. They were nationalistic, anti-communist, and loyal to government that Stalin intended to marginalize. Soviet forces approaching Warsaw on July 28th could hear sounds of fighting as Home Army launched uprising on August 1st. Soviet commanders requested permission to advance into city to support uprising. Stalin ordered them to halt on Vistula's eastern bank and conduct defensive operations instead. The Warsaw uprising would continue for 63 days without Soviet support. German forces would systematically destroy both the uprising and the city, and 200,000 Polish civilians would die. Stalin's cynical decision to allow Germans to eliminate Polish resistance that might have contested Soviet control represented political calculation that sacrificed Polish lives for Soviet strategic interests. The establishment of Vistula bridgeheads by Soviet forces in early August positioned Red Army for future operations toward Berlin, but also marked the end of Operation Bagration's continuous offensive phase. Soviet forces had advanced 600 kilometers from their June 22nd starting positions, liberated Belarus entirely, occupied eastern Poland, and destroyed German Army Group Center completely. But logistics had reached breaking point. Supply lines now stretched hundreds of kilometers through territory. With destroyed infrastructure, ammunition, stocks were depleted, fuel was critically short, troops were exhausted. Soviet commanders recognized that continued advance toward Germany would require operational pause to rebuild logistics, rest troops, and reinforce depleted units. Model, commanding German forces, also recognized operational situation and used Soviet pause to establish defensive positions along Vistula that would hold until January 1945. The race to the Vistula was complete. Soviet forces had won the race, but would need months to prepare for next phase of operations. The casualties from Bagration's extended operations into Poland remained controversial decades after war's end. Soviet sources initially claimed 60,000 to 180,000 casualties, depending on how deaths, wounded, and missing were counted, and what time period was considered. Post-war research suggested actual casualties might exceed 400,000, when accounting for the extended operations through August and including disease and non-combat losses. German casualties from Army Group Center's destruction exceeded 450,000, 170,000 killed, 250,000 captured, with tens of thousands missing, presumed dead. The casualty exchange ratio favored Soviets, but not overwhelmingly for every Soviet casualty. Approximately 1.1 German casualties occurred. What made Bagration strategically decisive wasn't casualty efficiency, but rather the operational consequences. Germany lost 50 divisions that couldn't be replaced. Soviet forces advanced 600 kilometers closer to Berlin, and the strategic initiative on Eastern Front was irreversibly transferred to Soviet Union. The drive to the Vistula transformed Eastern European geopolitics in ways that would persist for 45 years. Soviet forces now occupied Poland, Baltic states, and portions of Romania, positioning Stalin to dictate political arrangements across Eastern Europe. Western allies, still fighting in France and Italy, had no military forces in position to contest Soviet political control in the East. The division of Europe that would define Cold War was being established not through diplomatic agreements but through military facts on the ground. Churchill understood this clearly and urged Roosevelt to take firmer stance against Soviet political machinations. But Roosevelt prioritized maintaining Allied unity over contesting Soviet influence in regions where American forces couldn't operate. The consequences would include communist governments imposed across Eastern Europe, suppression of democratic movements, and division of continent that lasted until 1989. The military drive to the Vistula that concluded Operation Bagration was simultaneously the beginning of Soviet political domination of Eastern Europe, demonstration that Red Army had become most powerful military force on European continent, and proof that Germany's defeat was now only matter of time rather than outcome in doubt. The Wehrmacht had lost war in the East, even if final battles remained to be fought. And Soviet forces sitting on the Vistula in August 1944 were positioned to deliver the final blows that would end Nazi Germany and establish Soviet Union as European superpower. September 1st, 1944, the Führer bunker, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler studied the situation map of the Eastern Front and confronted a reality he had refused to acknowledge for weeks. The map showed Soviet forces positioned along the Vistula River in Poland, occupying all of Belarus, controlling Baltic approaches, and threatening East Prussia itself, German territory that had never been occupied by foreign forces in modern history. The map also showed something more troubling: blank spaces where German divisions should have been marked but no longer existed. Army Group Center, which had fielded 43 divisions in June, now controlled remnants of perhaps 12 divisions with combat effectiveness. 50 divisions had ceased to exist in 10 weeks. Hitler's military adjutant, attempting to brief the Führer on deteriorating situation, watched as Hitler's hands trembled while gripping the map table edge. The Eastern Front had collapsed in ways that German military planning had considered impossible, and the implications were unavoidable even to Hitler's delusional strategic thinking. Germany would lose the war unless miracles occurred, and miracles weren't appearing. What had happened in Belarus during those terrible summer weeks of 1944 was not merely military defeat but strategic catastrophe that made German defeat inevitable and imminent. The comparative analysis of Bagration versus D-Day revealed operational realities that complicated Western Allied narratives about who was winning the war. Allied forces landing in Normandy on June 6th deployed approximately 156,000 troops against German defenders, who were outnumbered but occupying prepared positions. By early September, Allied forces in France numbered roughly 2 million men facing approximately 800,000 Germans. The Normandy campaign from June through August cost Germans approximately 210,000 casualties killed, wounded, and captured. These were significant losses that crippled German defensive capabilities in the West. But Operation Bagration deployed 2.5 million Soviet troops against 486,000 Germans and inflicted over 450,000 casualties in roughly the same time period. The mathematical comparison was stark. Soviet operations had destroyed more than twice as many German soldiers as Western Allied operations, while advancing 600 kilometers versus Western Allies' advance of roughly 400 kilometers from Normandy beaches. The conclusion was uncomfortable for Western audiences who had been told D-Day represented the decisive campaign against Germany, but the evidence was undeniable. The decisive fighting was occurring in the East. German military leadership's assessment of strategic situation, following Bagration, revealed an organization that had lost faith in Hitler's leadership even while remaining bound by military discipline and personal oaths. General Heinz Guderian, who had replaced General Kurt Zeitzler as chief of the German Army General Staff in July, submitted a report to Hitler in August that described Eastern Front situation in brutally honest terms. Army Group Center's destruction represents greatest defeat in German military history, exceeding even Stalingrad in scope and consequences. We have lost 50 divisions that cannot be replaced. Soviet forces now possess overwhelming material superiority, operational initiative, and shorter supply lines to Berlin than we possess to adequate reserve positions. Unless political settlement can be negotiated immediately, German defeat is mathematically certain within 12 months. Hitler rejected Guderian's assessment, insisted that new weapons under development would reverse the situation, and ordered continued resistance. Guderian left the meeting understanding that Germany would fight until complete collapse rather than seek negotiated peace. The cascading strategic consequences of Army Group Center's destruction extended far beyond immediate tactical losses. German forces in the Baltic States Army Group North now faced encirclement as Soviet forces threatened to cut land communications with Germany. Hitler refused to authorize evacuation, dooming approximately 30 divisions to eventual capture or destruction. Romania, seeing Soviet forces approaching its borders and recognizing Germany couldn't protect it, switched sides on August 23 and joined Allies. This defection cost Germany access to Ploesti oil fields, the single most important source of natural petroleum that German military depended on. Without Romanian oil, German ability to fuel mechanized forces declined precipitously, forcing increased reliance on synthetic fuel production that Allied bombing was systematically destroying. Finland, another German ally, signed armistice with Soviet Union in September and expelled German forces from its territory. Bulgaria followed similar pattern. The defensive perimeter that Germany had constructed across Eastern Europe was collapsing not merely from military pressure, but from political defections, as Germany's allies recognized the war was lost and sought to minimize their own losses by abandoning sinking ship. The impact on German strategic reserve capacity was perhaps Bagration's most lasting consequence. Modern military forces require reserves, uncommitted formations that can be deployed to counter enemy breakthroughs, exploit opportunities, or reinforce threatened sectors. Germany had entered 1944 with limited but functional strategic reserves, primarily panzer divisions positioned centrally, where they could be deployed to either eastern or western fronts, as situations required. Bagration consumed these reserves entirely. Panzer divisions committed to attempting to seal Soviet breakthroughs were destroyed. Divisions that survived were too depleted to be reconstituted as effective combat formations. By September, Germany possessed no strategic reserves. Every division was committed to some sector of the front, and no uncommitted formations existed to respond to future crises. This meant every subsequent Soviet or Western Allied offensive would succeed because Germany had nothing available to counter breakthroughs. The Eastern Front had become one long crisis with no reserves to manage it. Western Front was approaching similar state, and German ability to conduct mobile defense, the doctrine that had enabled Germany to fight effectively despite numerical disadvantage, had been destroyed. Germany was now reduced to static defense everywhere, which meant defeat was just a matter of time. Western Allied military planners studying Bagration reached conclusions that influenced their own operational planning. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, received intelligence briefings describing Soviet operational techniques, massive artillery preparation, breakthrough by rifle divisions, exploitation by tank armies, bypass of strong points, continuous operations maintaining momentum. American and British planners recognized that, While Western armies couldn't replicate Soviet approach, casualty rates wouldn't be politically acceptable, and Western military culture emphasized different values they could adapt. Certain concepts. The emphasis on exploitation, rather than methodical advance, influenced Allied operations in France during autumn 1944. The recognition that German defensive capacity had been fundamentally weakened by Eastern Front losses encouraged more aggressive Western Allied planning. Most significantly, Bagration demonstrated that Germany was fighting two-front war it couldn't sustain, which meant Western Allied strategy should focus on maintaining pressure rather than attempting single knockout blow. Coordination between Eastern and Western offensives, ensuring Germany couldn't shift reserves between fronts, became explicit Allied strategy for war's final phase. The Soviet negotiating position at Tehran and subsequent Allied conferences had been strengthened enormously by Bagration's success. When Stalin met with Churchill and Roosevelt, Soviet military achievements spoke louder than diplomatic arguments. Stalin could point to Soviet forces occupying Poland, Romania, and Baltic states' military facts that gave him veto power over political arrangements in those regions. Western Allied protests about Soviet political actions in Eastern Europe were undercut by military reality that Soviet armies occupied the territory and Western armies didn't. Roosevelt's attempt to secure Stalin's agreement to democratic elections in Poland foundered on Stalin's simple response. Soviet Union had liberated Poland with Soviet blood, and Soviet security requirements demanded friendly government in Warsaw. Churchill understood that Soviet military dominance in Eastern Europe was creating a political situation that Britain couldn't alter. But he was unable to convince Roosevelt that firmer stance against Soviet political control was necessary, while Western allies still needed Soviet military pressure against Germany. The division of Europe into Western and Soviet spheres of influence wasn't product of Yalta agreements, it was product of military situations established during Bagration, when Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe and Western forces didn't. The psychological impact on German civilian population was as significant as military consequences. German civilians in eastern regions, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, began recognizing that Soviet forces were approaching and that their advance seemed unstoppable. These civilians had heard rumors about Soviet treatment of German populations in reoccupied territories, rumors that mixed accurate reports of revenge atrocities with exaggerated Nazi propaganda designed to stiffen resistance. The result was growing panic among German civilians who began evacuating westward in trickle that would become flood during winter of 1944 to 1945. German industrial production, already strained by Allied bombing and resource shortages, was further disrupted by civilian exodus that depopulated eastern industrial regions. German military recruitment became increasingly difficult as civilians recognized that military service meant deployment to Eastern Front, where survival prospects were minimal. The social cohesion that had sustained German war effort through years of hardship was beginning to fracture as civilians focused on personal survival rather than collective victory. The question of why Bagration succeeded when previous Soviet offensives had stalled revealed evolution of Soviet military capability that made 1944 fundamentally different from earlier war years. In 1941, Soviet Union had been surprised, poorly prepared, and tactically inferior to Wehrmacht. In 1942, Soviet forces were fighting desperately for survival and taking catastrophic casualties. In 1943, Soviet forces had achieved tactical competence and some operational successes, but still struggled with logistics and suffered setbacks. By 1944, Soviet military had completed transformation. Logistics could sustain deep operations, artillery preparation could reliably destroy German defenses, tank armies could exploit breakthroughs, Air Force could achieve air superiority, deception operations could achieve surprise, commanders could coordinate multiple fronts simultaneously. Add to this material superiority from Soviet industrial recovery and American Lend-Lease, and result was Soviet military machine that could execute operations at scale and sophistication that Germans couldn't match. Bagration succeeded because Soviet Union in June 1944 was different military power than Soviet Union of June 1941. It had learned every lesson 3 years of war could teach, had adapted its doctrine accordingly, and had built military capability that was genuinely superior to Wehrmacht in every measurable category. The historical assessment of Bagration's significance compared to other World War II campaigns remained contested decades after the war. Western historians tended to emphasize D-Day and Normandy campaign as decisive operations that led to German defeat, assessment that reflected Western Allied perspective but understated Eastern Front's importance. Soviet and Russian historians emphasize Bagration as the decisive campaign that destroyed Germany's largest army group and made German defeat inevitable. The truth likely incorporated both perspectives. Western Allied operations in Normandy forced Germany to fight two-front war it couldn't sustain, while Bagration destroyed German military capability in the east and positioned Soviet forces for final drive on Berlin. Neither operation alone was sufficient for Allied victory, but both together created strategic situation where German defeat was certain. What was undeniable was that Bagration represented largest single military operation in history, measured by troops committed, territory liberated, and enemy forces destroyed. It demonstrated that Soviet Union had become military superpower, whose operational art matched or exceeded German capabilities that had seemed invincible in earlier war years. And it established military dominance in Eastern Europe that would persist for 45 years until Soviet Union itself collapsed. The turning point in World War II occurred not on Normandy beaches but in forests and swamps of Belarus, where Soviet forces destroyed Army Group Center and demonstrated that Germany's war was lost. Everything that followed was denouement, playing out consequences of decisions made and battles fought during those crucial summer weeks when Operation Bagration transformed strategic balance and ensured Allied victory was only matter of BDO time.